Tonight, we're going to explore one of Westeros' most mysterious and misunderstood peoples. We'll journey into the swamps and mists of the Neck, that strange land between north and south, where the rules of the rest of Westeros have never quite applied. We'll discover the Crannogmen, those small folk who move through their watery world like shadows, who've guarded the approaches to the north for thousands of years, who know secrets that even Meisters cannot fathom. We'll meet House Reed, their quiet lords, and contemplate a culture so different from the castles and courts we usually imagine when we think of the Seven Kingdoms. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a tale of battles and intrigue, though both have certainly touched these people. Instead, we'll move slowly and gently through the history and ways of the Crannogmen, understanding how their land shaped them, how they've survived when others thought them weak, and what wisdom they carry that the rest of Westeros has forgotten. If you enjoy these calm explorations of the hidden corners of Westeros, a like and subscribe really helps others find these peaceful journeys through the world of ice and fire. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for valuing these quiet explorations of the places and peoples that don't always make it into the songs. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let's drift together into the mists of the Neck. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing urgent to attend to. Just the gentle unfolding of a story about water and wisdom, about a people who learn to thrive where others would perish. Before we can understand the Crannogmen, we need to understand their home, because perhaps nowhere else in all of Westeros has the land so completely shaped the people who live there. The Neck is a place unlike any other in the Seven Kingdoms, a vast wetland that stretches between the North proper and the Riverlands, a boundary between worlds that has remained largely unchanged since the Dawn Age. It's a region that exists in defiance of conventional geography, refusing to be simply land or simply water, instead occupying some liminal space between the two. The Neck begins where the King's Road descends from the rolling hills of the north and enters a world of water. For hundreds of miles, the land dissolves into swamp and bog, into channels and streams that shift with the seasons, into floating islands of earth that drift on deeper water beneath. It's a landscape that challenges every assumption about how ground should behave. What looks like solid earth might be a thin crust over deep mud that can swallow a horse and ride a hole. What appears to be impassable water might conceal a path just beneath the surface, known only to those who've travelled it since childhood. The water itself is murky, stained brown and green by the vegetation that chokes every channel and pool. In some places, the water is shallow enough that you could wade through it, though you'd be unwise to try without a guide who knows which pools contain quicksand, which harbour lizard lions, which are poisoned by some quality of the earth beneath. In other places the water is surprisingly deep, black pools that seem to have no bottom, that reflect the sky like dark mirrors when the rare sunlight breaks through the mist that almost perpetually shrouds the region. The mist itself is perhaps the Neck's most defining feature. It rises from the warm, stagnant waters, particularly in the cooler hours of morning and evening, creating a grey world where visibility extends only a few dozen yards at best. This mist carries with it the smells of the swamp, the rich rotting scent of vegetation breaking down, the sharp tang of stagnant water, the occasional sweeter note of some flowering plant that has adapted to these conditions. The mist muffles sound, making the Neck a place of strange acoustics where distant noises seem close, and near sounds fade to nothing. Through this watery maze wind countless channels and streams, some barely wide enough for a small boat, others broad enough to be considered rivers in their own right. These waterways are the highways of the Neck, the paths along which the Crannogmen move in their flat-bottomed boats, navigating by signs and markers invisible to outsiders. The channels shift with the seasons, with the long summers and the long winters that characterize Westeros. What is navigable one year might be choked with vegetation the next. What is dry land during a summer might be underwater when autumn brings its rains. The vegetation of the Neck is dense and varied, adapted to the constant moisture and the periodic flooding. Reeds grow everywhere, giving the region part of its character, their tall stalks swaying in whatever breeze manages to penetrate the mist. Willows drape their branches into the water, creating curtains of green that can hide entire settlements. Moss hangs from every tree, grey-green and thick, adding to the sense that everything here is slowly being reclaimed by the water. Among the more solid patches of ground you can find hardy trees, their roots adapted to the waterlogged soil, their trunks often rising from small islands that barely support them. The fauna of the neck is equally distinctive. Lizard lions, those massive reptilian predators that exist nowhere else in the Seven Kingdoms in such numbers, lurk in the deeper waters and along the muddy banks. They can grow to enormous size, 20 feet or more in length, with powerful jaws capable of dragging a grown man underwater before he has time to cry out. The Crannogmen have learned to coexist with these creatures, to read the signs of their presence, to avoid their hunting grounds, and occasionally to hunt them in turn for their hides and meat. Snakes are everywhere in the neck, some harmless, others deadly venomous. Water snakes slip through the channels, their dark bodies barely visible beneath the murky surface. Tree snakes coil in branches, waiting for birds or small mammals. The Crannogmen have developed an encyclopedic knowledge of which snakes to avoid, and which can be safely caught for food or for the properties of their venom. Frogs fill the night with their chorus, thousands upon thousands of voices creating a sound that visitors find either soothing or maddening depending on their temperament. The Crannogmen have learned to catch these frogs, which form a significant part of their diet. Birds are abundant, though different from those found in other parts of Westeros. Herons and egrets stalk through the shallows on their long legs, hunting for fish and frogs. Ducks and geese pass through during their migrations, providing seasonal hunting opportunities. Smaller birds flit through the reeds, their songs adding to the symphony of swamp sounds. The Crannogmen know the migration patterns, the nesting sites, the habits of every species. The climate of the neck is distinctive, warmer and more humid than the north proper, but cooler than the riverlands to the south. The constant moisture creates a greenhouse effect, trapping heat and creating an environment that can be stifling during summer. The humidity is omnipresent, making everything perpetually damp, rusting metal, rotting wood, creating ideal conditions for fungi and moulds. Visitors from drier climates often find the air hard to breathe, thick with moisture and the smell of decomposition. During Westeros's long summers, the neck becomes even more inhospitable to outsiders. The heat intensifies, the water levels drop slightly, but the mud becomes deeper and more treacherous, and diseases flourish. Fever comes to those unaccustomed to the region, a sickness carried by the tiny insects that swarm in clouds wherever standing water collects. The Crannogmen have developed some immunity to these fevers, or perhaps they've simply learned which herbs and treatments can alleviate the symptoms, knowledge passed down through countless generations. Winter in the neck is different but no less challenging. The cold never reaches the extremes of the north proper, the water providing a moderating influence that keeps the temperature relatively mild. But the rain increases, sometimes falling for days or weeks without cease, raising water levels, flooding areas that were navigable during summer, transforming the already difficult terrain into something almost impassable. Ice forms in the shallower pools during the coldest parts of winter, creating treacherous surfaces that can give way without warning. The strategic importance of the neck has been understood since the earliest days of recorded history. It is the gateway to the north, the only practical route for armies moving between the southern kingdoms and the domain of the Starks. The King's Road, that ancient highway that runs from Castle Black to Storm's End, must pass through the neck, and there is essentially only one route it can take, a causeway that threads through the least impassable section of the swamp. This causeway, built in the distant past, perhaps by the first men or even earlier, is the key to understanding the neck's military significance. It's a raised road, built up from the surrounding swampland, providing a solid path through the wetlands. But it's narrow, only wide enough for a few men to march abreast, and it's overlooked at its southern end by the ancient fortress of Moat Cailin. Moat Cailin stands as a monument to the strategic importance of the neck. It was built by the first men thousands of years ago, in the Dawn Age when the children of the forest still walked freely through Westeros, and the Andals had not yet crossed the narrow sea. The fortress once had 20 towers, massive stone structures that commanded the causeway and the surrounding swampland. From these towers, archers could rain arrows down on any army attempting to force the passage north. In the time we're contemplating, in the era of the books and the show, Moat Cailin is a ruin of its former self. Most of the 20 towers have collapsed, reduced to rubble by the slow erosion of thousands of years, by the constant moisture that works its way into stone and breaks it apart through countless cycles of expansion and contraction. Only 3 towers remain partially intact, And even these are crumbling, their stones green with moss, their interiors open to the elements. But even in ruins, Moat Cailin remains formidable when defended from the south. The causeway still passes beneath its walls, and any army attempting to march north must funnel through this narrow passage under the potential fire of defenders on the walls. The swamps on either side make flanking manoeuvres essentially impossible for conventional armies. You cannot march heavy cavalry through the bogs. You cannot bring siege engines across the uncertain ground. You cannot even be certain that what looks like solid land will support the weight of infantry and armour. This defensive advantage is held throughout all of recorded history. The Neck has never been conquered from the south. When the Andals swept across Westeros 6,000 years ago, converting or conquering every kingdom they encountered, they broke against the Neck like waves against a cliff. The Crannogmen and their allies, the Starks and the other First Men of the North, held Moat Cailin against every assault. Andal armies that tried to force the passage found themselves trapped on the narrow causeway, cut down by arrows, or they attempted to move through the swamps and simply disappeared, swallowed by quicksand, killed by lizard lions, or cut down by Crannogmen warriors who struck from the mist and vanished before any response could be organised. The Neck's role as Guardian of the North has shaped Northern identity and politics for millennia. The knowledge that enemies from the south must pass through this terrible gauntlet has given the North a security that no other region enjoys. The North cannot easily be invaded, cannot easily be conquered, because the Neck stands between it and any southern army. This security has allowed the North to maintain its distinct culture, its worship of the old gods, its connection to the traditions of the First Men, long after these were swept away in the southern kingdoms. But the Neck is more than just a military barrier. It's also a boundary between worlds in a cultural sense. North of the Neck, you find a land where the old gods are still widely worshipped, where weirwoods are sacred, where the old ways persist. South of the Neck, the faith of the Seven dominates, the Andal culture prevails, the old traditions have largely been forgotten. The Neck is the hinge between these worlds, belonging fully to neither, partaking of both. The ecosystem of the Neck creates challenges beyond the obvious military and navigational ones. The water, while abundant, is not always safe to drink. Many of the pools and channels contain water that can cause sickness in those who drink it. Something about the minerals leached from the soil or the decomposition of organic matter that makes it unwholesome. The Crannogmen know which sources are safe, know how to collect rainwater, know which plants can be used to purify questionable water. An army marching through would have to carry its own water, or risk the fevers that come from drinking the wrong source. Food in the Neck is available if you know how to find it, but it's not the kind of sustenance that supports large military formations. Fish can be caught in the channels, though they're often small and bony. Frogs are everywhere, and while many southern lords would turn their noses up at such fare, they're nutritious enough. Birds can be hunted, and their eggs collected if you know where they nest. Certain plants have edible roots or leaves, but all of this requires knowledge that outsiders lack, and the effort of gathering such food can hardly support an army. The Neck also seems to have a psychological effect on those who enter it unprepared. The constant mist, the limited visibility, the strange sounds echoing through the fog, the awareness that every step might lead to drowning or encountering a lizard lion, all of this wears on the nerves of soldiers used to fighting in open country. Armies that have attempted to force the Neck have often found their morale eroding before they ever encountered the enemy, the swamp itself becoming an adversary that saps the will to fight. For the people who call this land home, however, the Neck is not a hostile environment but simply home. A landscape they understand as intimately as a farmer knows his fields or a sailor knows the sea. The Crannogmen move through their swamps with a confidence that seems almost supernatural to outsiders. They can walk across areas of bog that would swallow an outsider, knowing by subtle signs where the ground is solid enough to bear weight. They can navigate the channels in complete darkness or thick fog, guided by landmarks invisible to others, by the sound of water flowing over particular rocks, by the feel of the current, by instincts developed over lifetimes spent on these waters. The seasonal transformation of the Neck is something that requires years to truly understand. During the long summers of Westeros, which can last a decade or more, the water levels gradually drop, exposing areas that were underwater during wetter periods. New islands emerge, channels shift their courses, the landscape slowly reconfigures itself. Then, when summer gives way to autumn and winter, the rains return, the water rises, and the neck transforms again, swallowing the exposed land, creating new channels, reshaping the maze of waterways. This constant change means that maps of the neck, such as they are always approximate and often quickly outdated. The maesters in their citadel have attempted to chart the region, but their maps are acknowledged to be more artistic than accurate, representing the general layout but unable to capture the reality of a landscape in constant flux. The Crannogmen don't use maps in the conventional sense. Their knowledge of their homeland is experiential, carried in memory, and passed down through oral tradition, updated constantly as they observe the changes that each season brings. There are deeper places in the neck, areas that even the Crannogmen approach with caution, pools that seem to have no bottom, where the water is unnaturally still and dark, islands that appear solid but shift beneath your feet, sections of the swamp where the mist never lifts, where sounds carry strangely, where even experienced guides become disoriented. These places feature in Crannogmen legends, stories of spirits and ancient powers, of children of the forest who might still linger in the deepest, most remote sections of the swamp. The boundary between the neck and the lands to its north and south is not sharp but gradual. To the south, the swamps slowly give way to the more conventional terrain of the riverlands, the water draining away, the ground becoming firmer, the vegetation changing from marsh plants to the trees and grasses of normal countryside. To the north, the neck transitions into the bogs and fens of the southern reaches of the north proper, still wet but less thoroughly waterlogged, the land beginning its slow climb toward the higher, drier territories where Winterfell and the other northern strongholds stand. This in-between quality, this sense of the neck as a threshold rather than a destination, has shaped how the rest of Westeros thinks about the region and its people. It's a place you pass through, not a place you go to. It's an obstacle to be overcome, not a territory to be coveted. No southern lord has ever seriously attempted to conquer and hold the neck, not because they respect the Crannogmen's ownership of it, but because there seems to be nothing there worth the effort of taking. No rich farmland, no valuable mines, no cities to tax, just endless swamp and the small, strange people who live there. But this dismissive attitude has always been a mistake, one that the Crannogmen have never bothered to correct. Let the southerners think the neck is worthless. Let them believe the Crannogmen are primitive and weak. Every such misconception is an advantage, another layer of protection beyond the swamps and mists. The truth, which we'll explore as we continue our journey, is that the neck has always been exactly what it needed to be. A land that shapes its people just as they shape their understanding of it. A place that has given the Crannogmen gifts that are simply invisible to those who value only what can be weighed in gold or measured in arable acres. As we drift further into this exploration, as we begin to meet the people who call this strange land home, keep in your mind this image of the neck at dawn, when the mist rises thickest from the water, when the world becomes simply shades of grey and green, when the calls of waterbirds echo through the fog, when everything is soft and quiet and mysterious. This is the world that made the Crannogmen, and understanding the land is the first step toward understanding the people. The land shapes the people, they say, and nowhere in all of Westeros is this more evident than with the Crannogmen of the Neck. These are a people who exist somewhat apart from the rest of the Seven Kingdoms, not by choice of isolation necessarily, but because the world they inhabit has made them into something different, something that doesn't quite fit the categories that the rest of Westeros uses to organize humanity. To understand who the Crannogmen are, we need to look not just at how they live, but at where they came from, at the deep history that made them unique among the peoples of the North. The origins of the Crannogmen are shrouded in the mists of time as thoroughly as their homeland is shrouded in the mist that rise from the water. What we know, or think we know, comes from fragments of legend, from the oral traditions that the Crannogmen themselves maintain, and from the speculations of maesters who have tried to piece together a history from limited evidence. The story is complicated by the fact that the Crannogmen, unlike most other peoples of Westeros, seem to be something other than pure descendants of the First Men or the Andals who conquered most of the continent. The most persistent theory, the one that appears in various forms throughout Northern legend, is that the Crannogmen carry in their veins the blood of the children of the forest, those mysterious beings who inhabited Westeros before the coming of men. The children were small of stature, dark and beautiful, with large eyes that could see in the dimmest light. They lived in harmony with the natural world, possessed abilities that men called magic, could enter the minds of animals, could see through the eyes of the weirwood trees, could shape the land itself according to their will. When the first men came to Westeros, crossing the land bridge that once connected the continent to Essos, they came into conflict with the children. The first men cut down the weirwoods to make farmland, and the children fought back, defending their sacred trees and their way of life. This conflict, the histories tell us, lasted for thousands of years before the pact was made at the Isle of Faces, that island in the God's Eye where children and first men agreed to live in peace, with the first men keeping the open lands and the children keeping the forests. But before the pact, and perhaps even after it, there were places where children and men lived in close proximity, where the boundaries between the peoples became blurred. The Neck, with its isolation and its unsuitability for the kind of farming that the first men practiced elsewhere, might have been such a place. Here, in the swamps where weirwood still grew and the old ways persisted, perhaps some of the children remained long after they had vanished from other parts of Westeros. And perhaps in those long-ago days, some of the first men who lived in the Neck took children as their mates, creating a bloodline that carried both human and child heritage. This theory would explain much about the Crannogmen, their small stature, significantly shorter than other descendants of the first men, averaging perhaps 5 feet tall or less, with builds that are slight and wiry rather than the robust frames of most Northmen. Their distinctive features, which include large eyes, often of unusual colours, particularly shades of green that seem to catch and reflect light in ways that other eyes do not. Their affinity for the swamps, their ability to move through terrain that defeats others, their almost supernatural skill at remaining unseen when they wish to be. Most significantly, the theory of children blood would explain the unusual frequency of greenseers among the Crannogmen. Greenseeing, the ability to have prophetic dreams, to enter the minds of animals, to see through the eyes of weirwoods, was once common among the children of the forest, but became increasingly rare among men. Even in the north, where the old blood runs strongest, greenseers appear perhaps once in 1,000 births, perhaps once in 10,000. But among the Crannogmen, the gift appears more often, suggesting that whatever allows greenseeing, whether it's something in the blood or something in the soul, is more concentrated in this population. Of course, this theory remains just that, a theory. The maesters are sceptical, as maesters tend to be about anything that smacks of magic or the supernatural. They propose more mundane explanations for the Crannogmen's distinctive characteristics. Perhaps the small stature is simply an adaptation to their environment, a trait that became concentrated through generations of living in the Neck. Smaller bodies require less food, can move more easily through dense vegetation, can balance more safely in the small boats that are essential to life in the swamps. The large eyes might simply be a trait that proved advantageous in the dim, misty environment, allowing better vision in low-light conditions. But the Crannogmen themselves, in their stories and songs, maintain their connection to the children. They speak of the green men who still live on the Isle of Faces, guardians of the ancient pact between children and first men. They tell stories of ancestors who learned the secrets of the swamp from the children themselves, who were taught which plants could heal and which could kill, who were shown the hidden paths through the bogs. Whether these stories are literal truth, metaphorical truth, or simply legend is perhaps less important than the fact that the Crannogmen believe them, that this connection to something older and deeper than the history of the Seven Kingdoms shapes how they see themselves and their place in the world. Whatever their origins, the Crannogmen who exist in the time of the books and the show are distinctly different from other Northmen. They are small, yes, but not weak. Their frames are lean and muscled, adapted to a life of constant physical activity, of poling boats through channels, of wading through mud, of climbing trees to gather birds' eggs or observe the land. Their hands are skilled at tasks that require precision and patience, at weaving nets from reeds, at crafting the 3-pronged frog spears that are their signature weapon, at preparing the poisons that coat their arrows and darts. Their faces tend to be angular, with sharp features that some find strange or unsettling. The eyes, those large eyes, come in various shades, but green is common, a green that can range from the pale shade of new leaves to the deep colour of forest moss. Their hair is typically brown or black, worn long by both men and women, often decorated with small charms or woven with reeds and feathers. They dress in colours that blend with their environment, browns and greens, mottled patterns that help them disappear into the swamp. The Crannogmen's approach to clothing is entirely practical, shaped by the demands of their environment. In the humid warmth of the neck, heavy fabrics are unbearable and unnecessary. Instead, they wear light garments, often made from woven reeds, or from leather that has been specially treated to resist the constant moisture. Their boots, when they wear them at all, are soft and flexible, allowing them to feel the ground beneath their feet, essential when walking across uncertain terrain where the difference between solid ground and deadly quicksand might be detected only through subtle differences in resistance. They carry their possessions with them, for in a land of floating islands and shifting channels, permanent structures are impractical. What they cannot carry, they cache in places known only to themselves. Hidden in the hollows of trees or on small islands that appear solid, but which they have enhanced and stabilized through techniques passed down through generations. They travel light by necessity, but what they carry is chosen with great care, every item serving multiple purposes, every tool maintained with meticulous attention. The social structure of the Crannogmen is different from the feudal hierarchy that dominates most of Westeros. While House Reed holds nominal lordship over them, acknowledged by the Starks and through them by whoever sits the Iron Throne, the reality is more complex and more egalitarian than the simple pyramid of lords and vassals. The Crannogmen live in small communities, extended family groups that occupy particular territories within the neck, territories defined not by rigid boundaries but by use and tradition. These communities are largely self-governing, making decisions collectively rather than deferring to the authority of a hereditary leader. When matters affect multiple communities, representatives gather to discuss and decide, a process that can seem frustratingly slow to outsiders, used to a lord simply commanding and being obeyed, but which creates decisions that have the genuine support of those they affect. House Reed's authority rests not on the power to command, but on the respect earned through wisdom, through service, through proven ability to lead in times of crisis. This more horizontal social structure reflects the demands of life in the neck. Survival in the swamps requires cooperation, requires sharing knowledge, requires trusting your neighbours to come to your aid when a lizard lion threatens or when sickness strikes. The kind of rigid hierarchy that works in settled agricultural communities, where lords can accumulate wealth and power through control of land, makes less sense in an environment where wealth is measured in knowledge and skills rather than in acres of farmland or herds of cattle. The Crannogmen's relationship with the natural world is intimate and complex in ways that other Westerosi cultures struggle to understand. They don't see themselves as separate from nature, as masters who have conquered and tamed the wilderness. Instead, they see themselves as part of the swamp's ecosystem, occupying a niche alongside the lizard lions and the frogs and the birds. They take what they need from the land, but they do so with an awareness of limits, an understanding that the swamp can provide abundantly if treated with respect, but can also withdraw its bounty if exploited carelessly. This relationship is reflected in their religious practices, which centre on the old gods, the nameless deities of the first men who are associated with the weirwood trees. The neck has weirwoods growing in scattered groves throughout the swampland, their bone-white bark and blood-red leaves standing out against the greens and browns of the surrounding vegetation. These weirwoods are sacred to the Crannogmen, places where they come to pray, to seek guidance, to commune with something larger than themselves. The practice of worship among the Crannogmen is quiet and personal, lacking the elaborate rituals of the Faith of the Seven, or even the more formalized traditions that have developed around the old gods in other parts of the north. A Crannogman might sit beneath a weirwood for hours, simply being present, listening to the wind in the leaves, feeling the presence of something ancient and knowing. They leave offerings, not expensive goods, but things that have meaning, a particularly beautiful stone, a perfect feather, water from a sacred spring. The greenseers among the Crannogmen, those rare individuals who possess the gift of prophetic dreams and the ability to slip into the minds of animals, hold a special place in their society. They are not rulers exactly, but they are consulted, respected, perhaps slightly feared for their uncanny knowledge. A greenseer might dream of where fish will be plentiful, might sense the approach of strangers days before they arrive, might know when a storm is coming, or when winter is about to give way to spring. This knowledge is practical and valuable, but it also serves to maintain the Crannogmen's connection to the older powers, to reinforce their identity as inheritors of something that predates the coming of the Andals, the Targaryen conquest, all the events that shaped the rest of Westeros. The Crannogmen's crafts and skills reflect their environment and their needs. They are master boat builders, creating the flat-bottomed vessels that can navigate the shallow channels and cross the floating vegetation. These boats are marvels of adaptation, light enough to be carried by a single person when necessary, stable enough to stand in while casting a net or thrusting a spear, silent in the water, leaving barely a ripple. They are made from wood that the Crannogmen know how to select and treat to resist rot, bound with reeds and sealed with substances derived from swamp plants. The frog spear is the weapon most associated with Crannogmen, a three-pronged implement that can catch a frog or a fish, can be thrust into an enemy in close combat, can be thrown with deadly accuracy at ranges that would surprise those who think of the Crannogmen as weak. The prongs are typically made from fire-hardened wood, or, for those who can obtain it, bronze or iron, barbed to prevent prey from escaping. A skilled Crannogman can strike a target the size of a frog from 20 paces away, can spear a fish in murky water by reading the subtle currents that indicate its presence. But perhaps the most feared aspect of Crannogmen martial skill is their knowledge of poisons. The swamps of the Neck are home to countless plants and creatures that contain toxic substances, and the Crannogmen have spent thousands of years learning which are deadly, which merely sicken, which can be combined to create effects more potent than either alone. They coat their arrows and darts with these poisons, they use them to defend their territory, and they guard the knowledge of their preparation as closely as any secret. These poisons are part of why the Crannogmen, despite their small stature and numbers, are so effective in defending the Neck. An arrow from a Crannogman's bow might be small, might not have the range or penetrating power of a longbow shot by a larger man. But if it strikes and delivers its poison, the target will die just as surely, often more painfully. The knowledge that any wound from a Crannogman weapon might be venomed creates a psychological effect beyond the physical danger, making soldiers cautious, making them see threats in every shadow. The Crannogmen also possess extensive knowledge of herbs and healing, the flip side of their knowledge of poisons. The same environment that produces toxic plants also produces medicinal ones, and the Crannogmen know how to identify them, how to prepare them, how to apply them for maximum benefit. They can treat the fevers that afflict outsiders who drink bad water, can create poultices that draw infection from wounds, can brew teas that ease pain or promote sleep. This knowledge is passed down within families, from parent to child, refined over countless generations of observation and experimentation. Their diet reflects what the Neck provides. Fish and frogs form the foundation, supplemented by birds and their eggs, by the occasional lizard lion when one can be safely hunted, by various plants that provide nutrition or flavour. They cultivate some crops on the more stable patches of ground, primarily vegetables that can tolerate the wet conditions, but they are not farmers in the sense that most Westerosi are. They are hunter-gatherers primarily, supplemented by small-scale cultivation, a lifestyle that again connects them more to the ancient past than to the agricultural present of the Seven Kingdoms. The cuisine of the Crannogmen is not the sort that would appeal to high lords in their castles, but it is sustaining and in its way sophisticated. They know how to prepare frogs so they are tender rather than tough, how to smoke fish so it keeps for weeks, how to render the fat of lizard lions into something that can be used for cooking or for waterproofing leather. They use herbs and swamp plants to add flavour, creating dishes that have a complexity that surprises those rare outsiders who taste them without prejudice. Their homes, such as they are, reflect the impermanence and mobility that life in the Neck requires. The Crannogmen do not build castles or even permanent villages in the conventional sense. Instead, they create what they call crannogs, small artificial islands built up from the surrounding swamp, reinforced with wooden pilings and covered with structures woven from reeds and small trees. These crannogs can be quite substantial, large enough to support several families, with platforms for living spaces, areas for storing supplies, places to keep their boats. But the crannogs are not fixed in place like castles. The channels of the Neck shift, water levels rise and fall, and the Crannogmen must be ready to move their homes, to rebuild in new locations when the old ones become untenable. Some crannogs are actually floating, constructed on rafts of woven reeds that ride the water, tethered to trees or pilings, but capable of being moved when necessary. This mobility means that finding a Crannogman settlement is nearly impossible for outsiders. The Crannogmen can simply move their homes, can vanish into the swamp, leaving no trace for pursuers to follow. The family structure among the Crannogmen tends toward tight-knit units, with multiple generations living and working together. Children are raised by the entire community, learning skills from whoever is most knowledgeable in each area. A child might learn boat building from one uncle, poison craft from a grandmother, hunting from a cousin, the stories and songs that carry their history from a great-aunt. This communal approach to child-rearing ensures that knowledge is widely distributed, that the loss of any one individual doesn't mean the loss of crucial skills. Marriage among the Crannogmen follows patterns that are their own. While there is an awareness of the need to avoid too much close breeding, the isolated nature of their communities means that everyone is related to some degree. They manage this through traditions about which relationships are acceptable and which are not, through occasional intermarriage with other Crannogmen communities, and perhaps, some whisper, through a bit of greenseer guidance about which unions will produce healthy children and which should be avoided. Their relationship with the rest of the North is complex. They are acknowledged as part of the North, as subjects of the Starks, but they are also somewhat apart, regarded with a mixture of respect and unease by other Northmen. The Crannogmen's small stature, their strange ways, their rumoured connection to the children of the forest, all of this marks them as different. They are useful allies, valued for their ability to defend the neck and for the specialised skills they bring when they choose to venture forth into the wider world. But they are also mysterious, unknowable, slightly unsettling. This perception suits the Crannogmen well enough. They have little interest in the affairs of the wider world beyond the neck. They don't seek to accumulate wealth or power in the conventional sense. They don't compete in tourneys or send their children to be fostered in the courts of great lords. They remain in their swamps, living their lives according to their own customs, bothering no one and asking only to be left alone. This isolation has protected their culture, has allowed them to maintain traditions that might otherwise have been eroded by contact with the more numerous and politically powerful cultures of the rest of Westeros. The Crannogmen's oral traditions carry their history and their identity. They have songs and stories that go back to the Dawn Age, tales of the first men and women who learned to live in the neck, of encounters with the children of the forest, of the making of the pact, of battles against the Andals, of the long night and the ancient heroes who fought the others. These stories are not written down, they are carried in memory, performed around fires on the rare dry nights, taught to children so that they in turn can pass them on. This oral tradition means that Crannogmen history is fluid, in ways that written history is not. The stories change slightly with each telling, adapt to new circumstances, incorporate new events while maintaining their essential truths. The same story might be told differently by different tellers, each emphasizing the aspects that seem most relevant to their audience. This flexibility means that Crannogmen history is alive in a way that the histories in the Citadel's libraries are not, constantly being reinterpreted, constantly being made relevant to the present moment. Among their stories are tales that other Northmen have forgotten or never knew, knowledge of the deeper past that was lost elsewhere but preserved in the neck's isolation. They remember things about the children of the forest that even the oldest records in the Citadel do not contain. They know songs in a language that might be a very ancient form of the common tongue, or might be something older still. They maintain traditions whose origins are lost even to them, practices that they continue because their ancestors continued them, because to stop would be to break a chain reaching back into a past beyond memory. The Crannogmen's relationship with time itself seems different from that of other Westerosi. Perhaps it's the nature of their environment, where the landscape is constantly changing yet somehow always remains the same, where the cycle of seasons is less pronounced than in the settled lands, where the distinction between past and present feels less sharp. They speak of ancestors from hundreds of years ago as if those people were personally known to them. They talk about events from the Dawn Age with a vividness that suggests these things happened recently, rather than thousands of years in the past. This different sense of time connects to their spirituality, to their relationship with the old gods and the weirwoods. When a Crannogman sits before a heart tree, before a weirwood with a face carved into its pale bark, They are not just praying to gods in some distant heaven. They are connecting to something immanent, something present in the tree itself, something that has witnessed all the ages of the world and carries those memories in its ancient wood. The green seers, when they slip into their visions, when they see through the eyes of the weirwoods, they experience time not as a linear progression, but as something more complex, where past and present and future exist simultaneously, where events echo across centuries. The crafts of the Crannogmen extend beyond the purely utilitarian. They create art, though it is art that serves purpose as well as beauty. They weave intricate patterns into their nets, designs that have meaning, that tell stories or invoke protection. They carve small figures from wood, representations of the animals they share their world with, effigies of the old gods, charms meant to bring luck or ward off danger. They make music with instruments fashioned from reeds and wood and gut, haunting melodies that sound like the wind in the trees, like water flowing through channels, like the calls of swamp birds. Their music is not the sort performed in castles, not the heroic ballads of knights and tournaments. It is quieter, more meditative, music meant to be heard around small fires on floating islands, music that blends with the ambient sounds of the swamp until it's hard to tell where the music ends and the natural world begins. They have work songs to make the labour of poling boats or weaving nets less tedious, lullabies to soothe children, mourning songs for those who have died. These songs carry their history as surely as the spoken stories do, preserving memories of events and people long gone. The Crannogmen's approach to death and mourning reflects their spiritual beliefs. When someone dies, they are often returned to the water, their body weighted and sunk into a sacred pool, given back to the swamp that sustained them in life. Or sometimes they are placed in a hollow tree, allowed to become part of the forest, food for the creatures in the soil, their substance recycled into new life. They do not build elaborate tombs or monuments. They remember their dead through stories and songs, through the continuation of their traditions, through the children and grandchildren who carry their blood and their knowledge forward. Among the Crannogmen, reputation is earned through demonstrated skill and wisdom rather than through birth or wealth. A person is respected for their knowledge of poisons, their ability to read the swamp, their skill with a spear or a boat, their capacity to make fair judgments in disputes. While House Reed carries the formal title of Lords, the actual influence any individual Reed commands depends on their personal qualities as much as their name. This meritocratic aspect of Crannogmen culture means that talent is recognised and utilised regardless of its source, that anyone who develops exceptional skill can find themselves in positions of informal authority. As we contemplate the Crannogmen and their culture, we might recognise something that the rest of Westeros often misses. These are not primitive people clinging to an obsolete way of life. They are a culture that has found sophisticated solutions to the challenges posed by their environment, that has preserved knowledge and traditions of immense value, that has maintained a way of being in the world that offers alternatives to the feudal hierarchies and constant warfare that characterise much of the Seven Kingdoms. They are small in stature and few in number, but they are not weak, not simple, not backward. They are different. And that difference is its own kind of strength, its own form of wisdom. As our journey continues, as we meet the Lords of House Reed and explore the Crannogmen's role in the greater events of Westeros, we'll see how this unique culture has shaped the history of the North and the Seven Kingdoms in ways that are often unrecognised but nonetheless profound. Among the Crannogmen, spread across their floating settlements and hidden granugs throughout the Neck, one family has held a unique position for as long as anyone can remember, or at least as long as the oral traditions reach back with any clarity. House Reed, with their black lizard lion on a grey-green field, are acknowledged as the Lords of the Crannogmen, the representatives of the Neck to the wider world of the North and the Seven Kingdoms. But their lordship is unlike any other in Westeros, shaped by the nature of their people and their land. Constrained and defined by circumstances that make them perhaps the strangest great house in all the realm. The origins of House Reed are obscured by time and by the nature of Crannogmen record-keeping, which relies on oral tradition rather than written chronicles. The maesters in their citadel have little reliable information about when or how the Reeds came to lead the Crannogmen. There are no documents establishing their authority, no charters from ancient Stark kings, no records of conquest or election. The Reeds simply are, have always been, as far back as memory reaches, the family that speaks for the Crannogmen when speaking to outsiders becomes necessary. One theory, supported by fragments of legend and the logic of how such things typically happen, is that the Reeds were chosen by the Crannogmen themselves, perhaps in some gathering of communities in the distant past, when the need for a single voice, a single point of contact with the Kingdom of the North, became apparent. The Crannogmen's more egalitarian social structure would make such a selection process natural, more natural than the hereditary lordship that characterises most of Westeros, where noble families trace their authority to conquest or royal grant. The choice of House Reed, if choice it was, might have been based on demonstrated wisdom, on proven ability to navigate between the Crannogmen's ways and the expectations of the outside world. Perhaps the first Reed who held this position was a green seer, gifted with prophetic dreams and the trust that such gifts inspire. Or perhaps they were simply individuals who showed exceptional diplomatic skill, who could sit in council with Stark Lords and their bannermen without losing the respect of their own people, who could explain Crannogmen culture to those who found it alien without betraying its essential character. Whatever their origins, the Reeds established a pattern of leadership that has persisted through all the documented centuries of Northern history. They are lords, but not in the way that the Boltons or the Umbers or the Karstarks are lords. They do not command in the conventional sense, do not demand obedience through threat of punishment, do not accumulate wealth or build monuments to their power. Instead, they serve as intermediaries, as the interface between the Crannogmen and the feudal structure of the North, translating between two very different ways of organising society. The seat of House Reed is Greywater Watch, and if the Reeds themselves are unusual, their castle is truly unique in all of Westeros. Greywater Watch is a moving castle, a fortress that shifts location, that cannot be found by those who do not know its secrets, that appears on no map with any accuracy. The very concept seems impossible to those raised in the stone castles of the south, but in the context of the Neck, it makes perfect sense. A castle that moves can never be besieged, can never be captured, can vanish into the swamps whenever danger approaches. The mechanics of Greywater Watch, how exactly it moves, are not fully understood by outsiders, and the Reeds have never explained. Some maesters theorise that it is built on a floating foundation, a massive crannog that drifts with the currents of the Neck, tethered perhaps to hidden pilings that can be released and re-established in new locations. Others suggest that there might be multiple structures, that what people call Greywater Watch is actually several different settlements, with the Reeds moving between them, making it appear that their castle relocates when in fact it simply shifts which of several locations is currently occupied. There are more fanciful theories as well, ones that the maesters dismiss, but that persist in the stories told in the north. Some say that Greywater Watch moves through magic, through the same ancient powers that the Children of the Forest once wielded, that green seers among the Reeds can will the castle to move and it obeys. Others claim that the castle is somehow protected by the old gods, that it exists partially in the normal world and partially in some other realm, and that this dual existence allows it to shift between locations in ways that defy normal understanding. What is certain is that Greywater Watch has never been found by anyone the Reeds did not wish to find it. Enemies who have attempted to locate the castle, to destroy House Reed and eliminate the leadership of the Crannogmen, have wandered the Neck until they died of fever, or were picked off by Crannogmen warriors, or simply gave up and retreated. Ravens sent to Greywater Watch somehow find their way there, suggesting that the castle, wherever it is at any given moment, remains connected to the communication network of the Seven Kingdoms, but how this is managed remains mysterious. The relationship between House Reed and House Stark extends back into the reaches of time, to the Age of Heroes perhaps, to the days when the Starks were still consolidating their control over the north. The stories tell of how the Crannogmen, led by the Reeds, helped the Starks defend against invasions from the south, how they held the Neck when the Andals came, how they remained loyal through all the long centuries when other houses might have tried to assert independence or switch allegiance to southern kings. This loyalty was not demanded through conquest. The Starks never invaded the Neck, never forced the Crannogmen to submit through military defeat. Instead, the relationship appears to have been built on mutual respect and mutual benefit. The Starks recognized the Crannogmen's autonomy, did not try to change their ways or impose southern feudal customs on them. did not demand more than the Crannogmen could reasonably provide. In return, the Crannogmen, through the Reeds, acknowledged Stark authority, came when called to defend the north, served as the guardians of the gateway that protected the kingdom from southern invasion. This partnership model is reflected in how House Reed fulfills its obligations to the Starks. Unlike other northern houses which provide men and materials based on the extent of their lands and the size of their population, the Reeds contribute based on their unique capabilities. They do not field large armies. They cannot, their population is too small and scattered. But when the North calls its banners, the Crannogmen who answer that call bring skills that no other bannerman can match. They serve as scouts, as guides in difficult terrain, as specialists in ambush and guerrilla warfare. 100 Crannogmen warriors, moving through swamps or forests, can accomplish things that 1,000 conventional soldiers cannot. They can slip behind enemy lines, can gather intelligence, can strike and fade away before any response can be organised. They know how to live off the land, how to navigate without roads or landmarks, how to use poison and stealth to multiply their effectiveness beyond their numbers. The taxation system that applies to House Reed is similarly adapted to their circumstances. They do not pay in gold or grain, for they have little of either. Instead, they provide service. They maintain the defence of the neck, ensuring that no southern army can march north without facing the deadly maze of the swamps. They provide guides when the Starks need to move forces through the neck, ensuring safe passage that would otherwise be impossible. They share their knowledge when requested, teaching selected individuals about herbs, about poisons, about the arts of moving unseen. This flexible arrangement demonstrates the Starks' political wisdom, their understanding that effective governance sometimes means adapting to local circumstances rather than forcing uniformity. A less wise or more rigid ruling house might have insisted that the Crannogmen conform to standard feudal practices, might have demanded stone castles and regular taxation and conventional military service. Such demands would have been impossible for the Crannogmen to meet, would have created resentment and conflict, might have driven them to rebellion or at least a sullen non-cooperation. Instead, by accepting the Reeds' different approach, the Starks secured genuine loyalty, the kind that cannot be forced but must be earned. The historical record of House Reed, such as it exists, is fragmentary and often frustrating for those who seek clear timelines and documented facts. The Masters have tried to create genealogies, to trace the succession of Reed lords through the centuries, but the information available is limited. The Crannogmen do not maintain written records in the way that other houses do. Names and deeds are preserved in oral tradition, in songs and stories, where they exist alongside myth and legend in ways that make it difficult to separate historical fact from embellished memory. We know that there have been Reed lords for at least 1,000 years, probably much longer. We know that they have always held Greywater Watch, that mysterious moving castle. We know that they have consistently supported the Starks, fighting in their wars, defending their borders, maintaining their loyalty through the long centuries. Beyond these broad outlines, the details become uncertain, fragmentary, subject to interpretation. Some stories tell of Reed lords who were great warriors, who led Crannogmen forces in battles that protected the north from invasion. Others speak of Reed lords who were greenseers, who used their prophetic dreams to guide their people, to warn of dangers before they manifested, to maintain the connection between the Crannogmen and the deeper powers of the old gods. Still others describe Reed lords who were primarily diplomats, who spent their lives navigating between the Crannogmen's needs and the Starks' expectations, who ensured that their people could maintain their way of life while still fulfilling their obligations to the larger kingdom. The lack of clear historical records might seem like a weakness, a sign of primitiveness or disorganization. But it can also be understood as a different approach to history, one that values the meaning and relevance of the past over the precise documentation of dates and names. The Crannogmen remember what matters to them, what shapes their identity and guides their actions. They remember the lessons of the past, the wisdom accumulated over generations. Whether a particular Reed lord lived 300 years ago, or 400 might seem important to a Maester compiling a genealogy, but it is less important to the Crannogmen than knowing what that lord did, what they taught, how they exemplified the qualities that the Crannogmen value. The size and composition of House Reed at any given time is similarly uncertain. Noble houses in Westeros typically consist of a main line, the direct descendants of the lord who will inherit titles and authority, along with various cadet branches, cousins and distant relations who share the family name and heraldry, but have less direct claim to power. House Reed appears to follow this pattern to some degree, but the boundaries are less clear than in other houses. The small population of the Crannogmen and their communal approach to child-rearing means that everyone is related to everyone else to some degree, and the distinction between direct family and distant cousins becomes somewhat blurred. We know that in the time period of the books and the show, House Reed was led by Lord Howland Reed, a man who would become perhaps the most significant Reed in all of their recorded history. But before we delve into Howland's story, which deserves its own space and time, we should understand what made House Reed, under any lord, such an effective leadership for the Crannogmen. The answer lies in how the Reeds managed to balance two often contradictory demands: the need to preserve Crannogmen culture and autonomy, and the need to maintain productive relationships with the larger political structures of the North and the Seven Kingdoms. This balancing act required Lords Reed to be bicultural in a sense, to be able to think and act like Crannogmen when among their own people, and to think and act like northern nobility when dealing with the Starks and other houses. They had to understand the value systems of both worlds, to know when Crannogmen traditions needed to be explained to outsiders and when they needed to be protected from outside interference. They had to know how to refuse unreasonable demands without giving offence, how to fulfil obligations in ways that worked for the Crannogmen while still satisfying the expectations of their liege lords. This cultural translation work was exhausting, and often thankless. The Crannogmen might see their lord as too accommodating to the Starks, too willing to engage with the outside world, too ready to explain and justify traditions that should be self-evidently correct. The Starks and other northern lords might see the Reeds as difficult, as unnecessarily resistant to sensible reforms, as stubbornly maintaining practices that seemed primitive or inefficient. The Reed lord who successfully navigated between these perceptions, who maintained the respect of both constituencies, demonstrated a political skill of the highest order. The physical structure of Greywater Watch, whatever its actual configuration, would reflect this dual nature. It needed to be impressive enough to be recognised as the seat of a great house, to be suitable for receiving visiting lords and their retinues, to demonstrate that House Reed was not just a collection of swamp dwellers, but a noble family with proper authority and status. But it also needed to be authentically Crannogmen, to be built in the style and manner of the Neck, to demonstrate connection to the land and the culture, rather than aping the stone castles of the south. The result, from the fragmentary descriptions we have from the few outsiders who have visited Greywater Watch, is a fascinating hybrid. The castle includes halls where formal business can be conducted, where visiting lords can be received with appropriate ceremony, where the trappings of noble status are displayed. But it also includes areas that are purely Crannogmen, built in the traditional style, using traditional materials, serving the practical needs of people who live in the swamps. The Great Hall might have a high table and benches for feasting, but it might also have walls made of woven reeds and a floor that slightly shifts with the water beneath it. The military aspect of House Reed's lordship is worth considering in more detail. While the Reeds could not field large armies, the forces they could provide were uniquely valuable. A Crannogmen warrior is trained from childhood in skills that conventional soldiers never learn. They can move silently through terrain that others find impassable. They can survive for weeks with only what they can forage. They can strike from ambush and fade away before retaliation is possible. They know poisons that can incapacitate or kill, that can be introduced through a tiny scratch or a contaminated water source. When House Reed called for warriors to support the Starks, the response might be only a few hundred fighters, but those fighters could accomplish objectives that thousands of conventional soldiers could not. During times of invasion or war, Crannogmen would harass enemy supply lines, would poison wells, would pick off stragglers, would gather intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. They would make any enemy force that entered the Neck regret that decision, would inflict casualties far out of proportion to their numbers, would demonstrate why the Neck had never been conquered from the south. This military capability meant that House Reed, despite their small numbers and limited resources, held real power, the kind of power that comes from being genuinely indispensable. The Starks needed the Crannogmen to defend the north-southern border, needed their specialized skills in certain kinds of warfare, needed their knowledge of terrain that no one else understood. This need created a kind of mutual dependence that strengthened the relationship between the houses, that ensured the Reeds were treated with respect rather than being dismissed as minor lords of a poor and primitive region. The question of succession within House Reed is interesting because it doesn't follow the rigid primogeniture that characterises most Westerosi noble houses. While leadership typically passed from parent to child, maintaining the family continuity, there seems to have been more flexibility about exactly which child inherited, and possibly even some input from the broader Crannogmen community about who would make the best lord. This makes sense given the Crannogmen's less hierarchical social structure and their tendency to value demonstrated ability over birth order. A Reed heir would be raised with an understanding of both worlds, spending time among the Crannogmen communities, learning the skills and knowledge that every Crannogman child learns, but also receiving some education about the wider world, about the politics of the North, about how to interact with other noble houses. They might spend time at Winterfell, fostered with the Stark children, learning the expectations and customs of northern nobility. This dual education ensured that each generation of Reeds could continue the balancing act that their position required. The economic basis of House Reed's power is almost non-existent in conventional terms. They have no gold mines or productive farmland. They cannot tax prosperous towns or control valuable trade routes. In the usual calculus of Westerosi wealth and power, House Reed should be among the poorest and weakest of northern houses, but they have something more valuable than gold in their context. They have knowledge and skills that cannot be bought. They control access to a region that shapes the strategic balance of the entire North. They provide services that no one else can provide. This unusual economic position meant that the Reeds could not play the game of Westerosi politics in the conventional way. They could not buy alliances with loans of gold, could not display their wealth through lavish tournaments or feasts, could not build impressive castles to demonstrate their power. Instead, their influence came from being essential, from holding a position that could not be filled by anyone else, from the respect earned through centuries of loyal service and demonstrated competence. The spiritual role of House Reed within Crannogmen society is also worth contemplating. While they were not priests exactly, Reed lords often seem to have stronger connections to the old gods than ordinary nobility. The prevalence of green seeing in their line suggested some special relationship with the deeper powers, some inheritance or blessing that set them apart. A Reed lord who was also a greenseer could provide guidance that went beyond political or military advice, could tap into prophetic knowledge that helped the Crannogmen navigate crises and make decisions that would affect generations. This spiritual dimension added another layer to the Reeds' authority, made them not just political leaders, but also connections to something older and more mysterious. When a Reed lord spoke, they might be conveying wisdom that came from green dreams, from visions seen through the eyes of weirwoods, from communion with powers that the rest of Westeros had largely forgotten. This made their counsel particularly valued, particularly weighty, even when it couldn't be rationally justified to those who didn't share the Crannogmen's spiritual framework. The isolation of House Reed, their removal from the political machinations of the North and the wider Seven Kingdoms, was both a weakness and a strength. They were not players in the Game of Thrones in the way that houses like the Lannisters or the Tyrells were. They did not seek to expand their influence or increase their wealth through marriages and alliances. They did not compete for positions on the King's Council or vie for royal favour. This meant they had less influence over events in the wider world, but it also meant they were less vulnerable to the dangers that came with such involvement. House Reed could focus on what mattered to them, on preserving their people and their culture, on maintaining the defence of the neck, on ensuring that each generation received the knowledge and skills that the previous generation had held. This focus gave them a kind of stability that more ambitious houses often lacked. They were not subject to the rises and falls of fortune that characterised houses that played the political game. They were steady, constant, reliable, qualities that the Starks valued highly in their bannermen. As we contemplate House Reed across the centuries, across the countless generations that have held Greywater Watch and spoken for the Crannogmen, we see a pattern of quiet competence, of leadership that serves rather than commands, of power that comes from knowledge and skill rather than from wealth or military might. The Reeds are not the greatest house in the North by most measures. They are certainly not the richest or the most powerful in conventional terms, but they are perhaps the most uniquely suited to their role, the most successful at preserving a distinct culture within the larger political structure of the Seven Kingdoms, the most effective at being exactly what they need to be. In this sense, House Reed represents an alternative model of nobility, one that doesn't rely on domination or the accumulation of wealth, one that finds its authority in service and knowledge and the trust of the people they lead. Whether this model could work in other contexts, whether other houses could learn from the Reed example, is an open question. But within the specific circumstances of the Neck and the Crannogmen, it has worked remarkably well, has survived for thousands of years, has maintained a culture that might otherwise have been absorbed or destroyed by the larger forces that have shaped Westeros. And as we'll see when we turn our attention to the most famous Reed Lord of all, this foundation of wisdom and service would prove crucial when the Crannogmen were called upon to play their part in the great events that would shake the Seven Kingdoms to their foundations. If you're finding these contemplative explorations of Westerosi history and politics a peaceful way to end your day, a like and subscribe really helps others discover these gentle journeys through the past. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of those who find comfort in slowly unfolding stories of power and patience, of roses growing strong through centuries of careful cultivation. The Neck's reputation as an impassable barrier, as the graveyard of southern ambitions, was not built on reputation alone or on the mysteries surrounding Greywater Watch. It was forged through actual conflict, through battles fought and won across thousands of years, through the practical demonstration that any force attempting to march north through the swamps would pay a terrible price for the attempt. The Crannogmen, led by the Reeds and guided by their intimate knowledge of their homeland, have defended the gateway to the north against invaders who came with armies that should have been overwhelming, with tactics that should have been irresistible, with determination that should have carried them through any obstacle. And yet, time and again, the Neck held, and the invaders either turned back or died in the attempt. The most famous of these conflicts, the one that established the pattern for all that followed, was the Andal invasion that swept across Westeros approximately 6,000 years before the time of the books and the show. The Andals came from Essos, crossing the narrow sea in their longships, bringing with them iron weapons, the faith of the Seven, and a cultural confidence born of countless victories over the peoples they had conquered in their original homeland. They were warriors and settlers both, seeking new lands, bringing their families, intending to stay, and to transform whatever they found into something that reflected their values and their gods. When the Andals arrived in Westeros, they found a land populated primarily by the First Men, the people who had come thousands of years earlier and who had made their peace with the children of the forest, who worshipped the old gods and maintained traditions that stretched back to the Dawn Age. The Andals saw these people as primitive, as heathens who needed to be converted or conquered, and they set about doing so with ruthless efficiency. The southern kingdoms fell one by one. The Andal warriors, with their iron swords and seven-pointed stars, proved superior to the bronze-armed armies of the First Men kings. The faith of the Seven spread across the land, replacing the quiet worship of the old gods. The weirwoods were cut down, their faces destroyed, their sacred groves turned into lumber for Andal halls and castles. The Andal wave rolled north, conquering the riverlands, pushing into what would later be called the Vale, spreading across the rich farmlands and forests of southern Westeros. But when they reached the Neck, when they stood at the southern edge of those endless swamps and contemplated the march north to conquer the Kingdom of Winter, the tide of conquest finally met an obstacle it could not overcome. The Andals attempted to force the Neck, assembled armies, marched them onto the causeway that led to Moat Cailin, and discovered that conquest requires more than superior weapons and religious fervour. The battles that followed were not the kind that would later be celebrated in songs, not grand clashes of armies on open fields, where heroes could display their prowess and kings could lead charges that broke enemy formations. Instead, they were grinding, miserable affairs, where Andal warriors marched into swamps and simply disappeared, where supply columns were ambushed and destroyed, where every step forward came at a cost that eventually became unsustainable. The Crannogmen, working with the Stark kings and the other lords of the north, turned the Neck into a killing ground that swallowed Andal armies whole. The Crannogmen's tactics in these battles established methods that would be used for thousands of years afterward. They did not meet the Andals in open combat, did not try to match iron swords with bronze weapons or match the Andals' superior armour and discipline. Instead, they used the swamp itself as their primary weapon, luring Andal forces onto paths that appeared solid but led into quicksand, into deep water, into places where even the best armour became a death sentence as warriors sank beneath the surface and drowned. The poisoned arrows that the Crannogmen used were particularly effective and particularly demoralising. An Andal knight in full armour might feel invulnerable to the small arrows fired by Crannogmen bows, might not even notice when one struck, the point barely penetrating the gaps in his protection. But hours later that knight would begin to feel sick, would develop fever, would weaken and die, and there was nothing his companions could do to save him. The knowledge that any wound, no matter how minor, might be fatal, created a psychological burden that wore down even the most courageous warriors. The Crannogmen also employed tactics of harassment that prevented the Andal armies from ever feeling secure, even when they managed to establish camps on what seemed like solid ground. Warriors would attack at night, slipping into camps, cutting throats, poisoning water supplies, setting fires, and vanishing before any effective response could be organised. Sentries would disappear without a sound. Patrols sent to scout the surrounding area would fail to return. The constant state of alert, the inability to ever rest or feel safe, the steady attrition of men who simply vanished into the swamp, all of this eroded military effectiveness more surely than any pitched battle could have. Moat Cailin itself played a crucial role in the defence against the Andals. The fortress, still whole in those days, all 20 of its towers intact and manned, commanded the causeway that any army would have to use to march north. The Andals attempted to take it through assault, sending their warriors up the causeway to attack the walls, but the narrow approach meant that only a small number of men could attack at any one time, while defenders on the walls above could rain down arrows, stones, and boiling liquids on the attackers. Assault after assault broke against Moat Cailin's defences, piling the causeway with dead without ever seriously threatening the fortress itself. The Andals tried to bypass Moat Cailin by finding other routes through the neck, but this proved even more disastrous. The Crannogmen knew every channel, every path, every area of solid ground in the vast swamp. The Andals did not. Armies that attempted to move through the neck away from the causeway found themselves lost, wandering in circles, running out of supplies, succumbing to disease, and to the constant attacks by Crannogmen warriors who struck and faded like ghosts. The lizard lions took their toll as well, dragging men from the edges of formations, creating a constant state of fear that made it difficult to maintain discipline and cohesion. The Andal commanders tried various strategies to overcome the neck's defences. They attempted to build their own forts, to establish strong points that could serve as bases for further advances, but maintaining supply lines to these forts proved impossible. The Crannogmen would interdict the supplies, and the garrisons would slowly starve, would be forced to either retreat or attempt to live off the land, which meant dispersing into the swamp where they could be picked off individually. Some Andal leaders tried to make alliances with the Crannogmen, to bribe or persuade them to allow passage, but the Crannogmen had no interest in betraying the North, and their loyalty to the Starks held firm. The faith of the Seven sent missionaries along with the armies, priests who preached the superiority of their religion, who declared that the old gods were false and powerless, that the Seven would grant victory to their faithful warriors. These priests found few converts among the Crannogmen, who maintained their devotion to the weirwoods and the nameless gods of forest and stream. The missionaries themselves often fell victim to the swamp, to disease or accident or the silent arrows of Crannogmen, who had no patience for those who insulted their gods and their traditions. The fighting in the neck during the Andal invasion lasted for years, perhaps decades, though the exact chronology is lost to time and the incomplete nature of the records. Wave after wave of Andal warriors entered the swamps, and wave after wave failed to emerge. The flower of Andal chivalry, knights who had conquered kingdoms in the south, who had won great victories and earned fearsome reputations, disappeared into the mist and were never seen again. Their bones lie still in the mud of the neck, their armour rusted and buried, their names forgotten except perhaps in the songs that the Crannogmen sing around their fires. Eventually, the Andal invasion simply stopped attempting to force the neck. The cost had become too high, the prospect of success too remote. The Andal kingdoms that had been established in the south turned their attention to consolidating their rule, to fighting among themselves, to the normal pursuits of kingdoms rather than continuing to throw armies into the swamp that swallowed them without return. The north remained unconquered, the only region of Westeros where the first men maintained their rule, where the old gods were still worshipped, where the ancient ways persisted, and the Neck, with its Crannogmen defenders, was the reason why. The successful defence against the Andals established the Crannogmen's reputation and established the pattern that would be repeated in later conflicts. The Neck was not just difficult to conquer, it was effectively impossible to conquer from the south. Any army attempting it would be destroyed, not through decisive battle but through attrition, through the slow grinding down of morale and numbers and supplies, until nothing remained but the choice to retreat or die. This reputation became a strategic asset in itself, deterring future invasions, making enemies think twice before attempting to march north. But the defence of the Neck came at a cost to the Crannogmen themselves, a cost that is often overlooked when the stories of their victories are told. The fighting took its toll on their population. Crannogmen warriors died defending their homeland, killed in ambushes, in raids on Andal camps, in the defence of Moat Cailin. The families they left behind suffered, children grew up without fathers, communities lost their most skilled hunters and warriors. The constant state of warfare disrupted normal life, made it difficult to maintain the routines of fishing and foraging that sustained the Crannogmen communities. The swamps themselves suffered damage from the invasion. The Andals, in their frustration, sometimes deliberately destroyed what they could, burning sections of swamp vegetation, poisoning water sources, killing wildlife out of spite when they could not kill the Crannogmen who eluded them. Some of this damage was temporary, the swamp's resilient ecology recovering once the fighting ended. But some scars lasted longer. Areas where the vegetation never quite grew back the same way, where the water remained tainted for generations, where the memories of violence seemed to linger in the very earth and water. The psychological impact on the Crannogmen is hard to measure, but was certainly real. Generations grew up knowing that enemies might come at any time, that the defence of their homeland might require them to fight, and possibly die. The stories of the Andal invasion became part of the Crannogmen's cultural memory, shaping how they saw themselves and their role in the north. They were the guardians, the defenders, the people who stood between the north and its enemies. This identity brought pride but also burden, the weight of responsibility that could never be set aside. In later centuries, other conflicts tested the Neck's defences, though none matched the scale or duration of the Andal invasion. There were raids from the south, attempts by ambitious lords to extend their territory northward, expeditions by those who thought they could succeed where the Andals had failed. Each time, the result was the same. The Neck held. The Crannogmen, using tactics refined over generations, destroyed or turned back every attempt at invasion. Moat Cailin, though it slowly fell into ruin over the millennia, remained a formidable obstacle when defended, its strategic position unchanged even as its towers crumbled. The Crannogmen's military effectiveness was not limited to defence of their own territory. When the Stark kings called their banners to fight wars elsewhere in the north, or when the unified kingdom of the north under the Targaryens required northern forces for campaigns in the south, the Crannogmen who answered those calls brought their specialised skills to battles far from the Neck. They served as scouts, as rangers, as specialists in ambush and night fighting. They were particularly valuable in campaigns that involved fighting in forests or rough terrain, where their ability to move unseen and strike from unexpected directions could turn battles. There are fragmentary records of Crannogmen serving in various northern campaigns over the centuries. They fought against wildling invasions from beyond the wall, using their tracking skills to locate raiding parties, their knowledge of poison to tip arrows that would bring down even the fiercest wildling warriors. They participated in wars between northern houses, though always on the side of the Starks, maintaining their loyalty to their liege lords even when other bannermen might have been tempted to switch sides based on advantage or old grudges. The Crannogmen's contribution to these campaigns was often disproportionate to their numbers. 100 Crannogmen might accomplish objectives that would require 1,000 conventional soldiers, or might accomplish those objectives with far fewer casualties, or might accomplish them in ways that left enemies demoralised and afraid. The sight of Crannogmen warriors among a northern army became a sign that the campaign would be conducted with skill and cunning, that simple numerical superiority would not be enough for the enemy, that they would face opponents who fought with their minds as much as with their weapons. But the Crannogmen's military service was always balanced against the need to maintain the defence of the Neck itself. House Reed and the Stark Lords understood that the Crannogmen could not be deployed in large numbers for distant campaigns without weakening the security of the north-southern border. There was always a calculation, a judgment about how many warriors could be spared for external wars while ensuring that enough remained to defend the swamps if an enemy attempted to exploit the North's attention being elsewhere. This strategic calculation meant that Crannogmen forces were used selectively, deployed where their unique capabilities would be most valuable, rather than being thrown into every battle simply to increase numbers. A wise northern commander would save his Crannogmen forces for situations where stealth and ambush were crucial, where conventional tactics had failed or seemed unlikely to succeed, where the psychological impact of the Crannogmen's reputation could be leveraged to maximum effect. The relationship between military service and cultural preservation was complex for the Crannogmen. Fighting in distant wars exposed them to the wider world, to different ways of fighting and living, to cultures and ideas that might influence how they thought about their own traditions. Young warriors who served in campaigns in the south or in the north proper might return to the Neck with questions about why things were done certain ways, with ideas about changes that could be made, with a perspective that came from having seen alternatives to the Crannogmen way of life. This exposure could be both enriching and destabilizing. It brought new knowledge, new skills, new understanding that could benefit the Crannogmen communities, but it also created potential for cultural erosion, for the slow loss of traditions that had been maintained for thousands of years. The elders and the leaders of House Reed had to manage this tension carefully, had to find ways to allow young warriors to gain experience in the wider world while ensuring that they remained connected to their roots, that they didn't come to see Crannogmen culture as inferior or primitive compared to what they encountered elsewhere. The cost of military service, measured in lives lost, was a burden that the Crannogmen communities bore across the generations. Unlike the great houses with their large populations and multiple cadet branches, the Crannogmen could ill afford to lose warriors. Each death diminished their already small numbers, removed knowledge and skills that had taken years to develop, left gaps in families and communities that might never be filled. The decision to send warriors to fight in the Stark's wars was never taken lightly, was always weighed against the cost to the Crannogmen themselves. The Crannogmen who died in these distant campaigns were buried far from the Neck, far from the swamps that had been their home, in soil that was dry and foreign. Their bodies could not be returned to the water, could not be given the traditional Crannogmen rights. This separation from their homeland, even in death, was a sacrifice that went beyond the simple loss of life, was a sundering from the land and the traditions that had defined them. The families who mourned these fallen warriors mourned not just the loss of a person, but the loss of a proper ending, the inability to complete the rituals that would have eased the dead into whatever lay beyond. The weapons and tactics of the Crannogmen evolved over the centuries of conflict, refined by experience, adapted to new enemies and new situations. The three-pronged frog spear remained central to their arsenal, but techniques for using it were constantly improved, passed down from master to student, adjusted based on lessons learned in actual combat. The poisons became more sophisticated, with different formulations for different purposes, some designed to kill quickly, others to incapacitate, still others to cause pain and fear without necessarily being fatal. The Crannogmen also adapted their tactics based on the enemies they faced. Against heavily armoured knights, they learned to target the joints in armour, the vulnerable points where a small arrow or dart could slip through and deliver poison. Against larger forces, they perfected techniques of dispersed attack, never concentrating in ways that would allow the enemy to bring superior numbers to bear, instead spreading out and attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, creating the impression of facing a larger force than actually existed. The use of the terrain continued to be the Crannogmen's greatest advantage. They knew how to use mist for concealment, how to move through water without creating ripples that would betray their position, how to hide in vegetation in ways that made them effectively invisible, even to observers who were looking directly at their location. They could lie motionless in mud for hours if necessary, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They could swim underwater, breathing through reeds, approaching targets from below where no sentry would think to watch. The psychological warfare aspect of Crannogmen tactics became increasingly sophisticated over time. They learned that the fear they could inspire was as valuable as the actual damage they inflicted. A Crannogmen warrior who killed one enemy but made 10 others afraid to sleep, afraid to drink the water, afraid to step off established paths, accomplished more than if he had killed all 11. The Crannogmen cultivated their reputation deliberately, ensured that stories of their capabilities spread, allowed their enemies' imaginations to magnify the threat they posed. The defense of the neck required not just individual skill, but also coordination among the scattered Crannogmen communities. When threats appeared, information had to be shared quickly, forces had to be organized and deployed, strategies had to be agreed upon. The Crannogmen developed systems for communication that allowed them to coordinate across the vast swamp, using signals that outsiders could not interpret, runners who could move through the neck with incredible speed, perhaps even using the abilities of greenseers to share information in ways that transcended normal communication. House Reed played a crucial role in this coordination, serving as the central authority that could direct the overall defense while allowing individual communities to manage their own tactical situations. A Reed Lord with green sight might see in dreams where enemies were massing, where attacks would come, allowing defences to be prepared in advance. Even without such supernatural guidance, the Reeds' position at Greywater Watch, their relationships with communities throughout the neck, their accumulated experience over generations, made them natural coordinators of defensive efforts. The economic cost of maintaining defensive readiness was another burden the Crannogmen bore. Warriors who were preparing for battle or engaged in fighting could not also be fishing or hunting or gathering the resources that their families needed to survive. Communities had to maintain reserves of supplies, had to ensure that those who stayed behind could support both themselves and the warriors who fought on their behalf. This required careful planning, required sacrifice, required a communal approach where everyone understood that the security of all depended on the willingness of each to bear their share of the burden. As we contemplate these centuries of conflict, these countless battles and skirmishes and ambushes that defended the neck and the north, we might reflect on what they cost and what they preserved. The Crannogmen paid in blood and suffering and loss, paid through generations of warriors who died defending their homeland, paid through the disruption of their normal lives, through the psychological burden of constant vigilance. But what they preserved was their culture, their way of life, their connection to traditions that stretched back beyond memory. They preserved the North's independence and distinct character, ensured that at least one region of Westeros remained where the First Men's ways persisted, where the old gods were still worshipped, where the ancient knowledge had not been entirely lost. Whether this was worth the cost is not for us to judge, but we can recognize that the Crannogmen themselves seemed to believe it was, seemed to accept the sacrifices required to maintain their identity and their freedom. And their success in defending the neck, repeated across thousands of years against enemy after enemy, suggests that perhaps they understood something about what truly matters, something that those who measure everything in gold and conquest have always failed to grasp. The pattern of Crannogmen defending their homeland, of House Reed leading their people through centuries of conflict, was preparation for a moment that would come in the relatively recent history of Westeros, a moment when one particular Reed Lord would step onto the stage of great events and change the course of history in ways that are still being felt generations later. Howland Reed, the current Lord of Greywater Watch in the time of the books and the show, is perhaps the most significant Crannogman who has ever lived, not because he commanded great armies or accumulated vast wealth, but because he was present at crucial moments, because he knew things that others did not know, because his choices and his silences have shaped the world in profound ways. To understand Howland Reed is to understand how a small man from the swamps could become central to the greatest secrets of the Seven Kingdoms. Howland Reed's early life is largely unknown to us, lost in the general obscurity that surrounds the Crannogmen and their affairs. We know he was born sometime in the middle of the 3rd century after Aegon's conquest, that he grew up in the neck as the son and heir of the previous Reed Lord, that he learned the skills and knowledge that every Crannogman learns, how to move through the swamps, how to survive in that harsh environment, how to fight in the ways that his people had refined over thousands of years. But at some point in his youth, Howland did something unusual for a Crannogman, something that would shape everything that came after. He left the neck and travelled south, seeking something, though what exactly he sought is a matter of legend and speculation rather than documented fact. The stories say that Howland journeyed to the Isle of Faces, that mysterious island in the God's Eye where the children of the forest and the first men made their pact thousands of years ago, where weirwoods still grow in great numbers, where it is said that green men still live, the last remnants of a vanished age. The Isle of Faces is forbidden to ordinary people, its shores guarded, its interior unknown to all but those who are permitted to land there. But Howland, it seems, was granted access, was allowed to walk among the weirwoods, was taught or shown something by the green men who dwell there. What happened to Howland on the Isle of Faces is unknown. He never spoke of it directly, never explained what he learned or experienced during his time there. But when he returned from that journey, those who knew him said he was changed, that he carried himself differently, that his eyes seemed to see things that others could not see. There were whispers that he had been trained as a green seer, that he had been initiated into mysteries that dated back to the Age of Heroes, that he had been given knowledge about the deeper patterns of history and prophecy that would guide his actions in the years to come. Whether Howland's visit to the Isle of Faces was the result of green dreams that directed him there, or whether it was simply the choice of a young man seeking understanding beyond what his own culture could provide, we cannot know. But the timing was significant because shortly after his return from the Isle of Faces, Howland found himself travelling to a tournament that would change his life and, though he could not have known it at the time, would set in motion events that would eventually shake the foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. The tournament at Harrenhal in the year 281 after Aegon's conquest was the largest and most magnificent tournament that had been held in living memory. Lords and knights from all over Westeros gathered at the massive ruined castle that Aegon the Conqueror's dragon had melted centuries before. The tournament was ostensibly a celebration, a chance for the realm's nobility to display their prowess and their wealth, but there were darker currents beneath the surface, political machinations and conspiracies that would only become clear later, after events had run their course. Howland Reed attended this tournament, though why he chose to do so is uncertain. Crannogmen rarely ventured so far from the Neck, rarely participated in the tournaments and gatherings that occupied the nobility of the southern kingdoms. Perhaps he was curious about the wider world after his experiences at the Isle of Faces. Perhaps he felt drawn to Harrenhal for reasons he could not fully articulate, the kind of intuition that sometimes guides those who have the green sight. Or perhaps he simply wanted to see the famous lords and knights, to witness the spectacle of southern chivalry, to understand better the world beyond the swamps. What we know for certain is that Howland's experience at Harrenhal was not entirely pleasant. He was a small man even by Crannogmen standards, slight and wiry, dressed in the simple practical clothing of his people rather than the fine fabrics and elaborate armour that the southern lords wore. He must have seemed strange and out of place among the pavilions and pageantry, and there were squires in service to some of the noble houses who found his presence amusing, who decided to make sport of this odd visitor from the swamps. These squires, young men training to become knights, sons of noble houses who should have known better, accosted Howland and began to torment him. The exact nature of their harassment is not recorded in detail, but it seems to have been physical as well as verbal, the kind of bullying that young men sometimes engage in when they have power and no immediate consequences to fear. Howland, though skilled in the ways of Crannogmen combat, was alone and outnumbered. Unable to defend himself effectively against multiple opponents who were larger and equipped with proper weapons. The intervention that saved Howland came from an unexpected source. 3 of Lord Eddard Stark's siblings, who were also attending the tournament, came upon the scene and put a stop to the harassment. Benjen, Brandon and Lyanna Stark, children of one of the great houses of Westeros, took the part of this small Crannogman against the squires who were tormenting him. They drove off the bullies and helped Howland to his feet, treated him with kindness and respect, asked if he was injured and offered him their protection for the remainder of the tournament. This act of compassion created a bond between Howland Reed and the Stark family that would last for the rest of Howland's life. He had been shown kindness when he was vulnerable, had been defended by people who had no obligation to help him, who gained nothing from coming to his aid except the satisfaction of doing what was right. For someone like Howland, raised in the Crannogmen culture that valued loyalty and honour, this created a debt that could never truly be repaid. But more than that, it created genuine friendship, the kind of connection that transcends calculation and obligation. The tournament at Harrenhal proceeded over the following days, and Howland watched events unfold that would later be revealed as pivotal to the history of Westeros. There was the mystery of the Knight of the Laughing Tree, a small knight in mismatched armour, who appeared in the lists and defeated the 3 squires who had tormented Howland, demanding that they teach their squires honour as forfeit for their defeat. The identity of this mystery knight was never officially revealed, but there are strong suggestions in the stories, hints and implications, that it was Lyanna Stark herself, disguised in armour, defending Howland's honour in a way that was both bold and deeply against the conventions of Westerosi society. If Lyanna was indeed the Knight of the Laughing Tree, if she fought to avenge the insult to Howland and to punish those who had behaved dishonourably, then Howland would have known her secret, would have been one of the very few people who understood what had actually happened. This shared secret would have deepened the bond between them, would have made Howland privy to Lyanna's courage and her willingness to defy convention, qualities that would be important in understanding the events that followed. The tournament also saw the famous moment when Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, after winning the tournament's final joust, rode past his own wife Elia Martell and placed the crown of winter roses in Lyanna Stark's lap, naming her the Queen of Love and Beauty instead of his spouse. This act shocked the assembled nobility, was seen as a terrible insult to Princess Elia, and created tensions that would contribute to the events that would later tear the realm apart. Howland witnessed this moment, saw the reactions of those involved, perhaps understood through green sight or simple observation that something significant had just happened, that the world had just shifted in ways that would have profound consequences. After the tournament ended, Howland returned to the Neck, back to his role as heir to House Reed, back to the familiar world of the swamps and the Crannogmen. But he carried with him the memory of what had happened at Harrenhal, the friendship he had formed with the Stark siblings, the secrets he had witnessed. And when, less than a year later, the realm exploded into war, when Robert's rebellion began and tore the Seven Kingdoms apart, Howland Reed made a choice that would define the rest of his life. The details of Robert's rebellion are well known, how Robert Baratheon rose against King Aerys II Targaryen, how the great houses chose sides, how battles were fought and kingdoms were torn apart. What matters for our purposes is Howland Reed's role in these events. When Lord Eddard Stark called his banners to support Robert's rebellion, when the North mobilised for war, Howland Reed answered that call. He gathered what forces the Crannogmen could provide and marched south to fight alongside his friend Ned Stark. The Crannogmen forces that Howland led were not numerous, perhaps a few hundred warriors at most, but they brought their specialised skills to the rebellion. They served as scouts and rangers for the northern armies, used their knowledge of guerrilla warfare to harass supply lines and gather intelligence, fought in ways that multiplied their effectiveness beyond their numbers. Howland himself proved to be an able leader, skilled not just in the tactics of swamp fighting, but in the broader strategy of warfare, able to coordinate with other commanders, to adapt Crannogmen methods to different terrain and different enemies. The war lasted for the better part of a year, and Howland fought through all of it. Was present at battles whose names have become famous in the histories. He saw the best and worst of what humans are capable of, witnessed courage and cowardice, honour and betrayal, the grinding reality of war that is so different from the songs and stories that celebrate it. He lost men under his command, warriors from the Neck who died far from home, whose bodies could not be returned for proper Crannogmen burial rites. He bore the weight of those losses, the responsibility that comes with leadership, the knowledge that his choices had led to deaths that might have been avoided. But all of this, all the battles and the marches and the strategy and the sacrifice, was merely preparation for the moment that would define Howland Reed's place in history. Near the end of the rebellion, after Robert had smashed the Targaryen forces at the Trident, after King's Landing had fallen and the royal family had been slaughtered or fled into exile, Ned Stark rode south with 6 companions to a place in the Mountains of Dawn called the Tower of Joy. What happened there has become one of the greatest mysteries of recent Westerosi history, and Howland Reed is the only living person who knows the full truth. The Tower of Joy was where 3 of the Kingsguard, the finest knights in the 7 Kingdoms sworn to protect the royal family, had been stationed by Prince Rhaegar before he rode north to his death at the Trident. These 3 knights, Sir Arthur Dayne called the Sword of the Morning, Sir Oswell Went, and Lord Commander Gerald Hightower called the White Bull, were among the most formidable warriors in Westeros, and they were guarding something, or someone, in that tower. Something important enough that they remained at their post even after their king was dead, Even after the rebellion had been lost, even when the sensible course would have been to flee or to seek terms, Ned Stark came to the Tower of Joy seeking his sister Lyanna, who had been allegedly abducted by Prince Rhaegar a year earlier, whose disappearance had been one of the sparks that ignited the rebellion. With Ned came 6 companions, all skilled warriors, including Howland Reed. What they found were the 3 Kingsguard, standing before the tower, refusing to yield, refusing to allow passage. Words were exchanged, the exact content lost to time, except for fragments that have come down to us. Sir Arthur Dayne said something about wishing Ned good fortune in the wars to come, an odd thing to say when the war was already over. Ned replied that the war was done, but Sir Arthur said not for them. Not for the Kingsguard, who still had a duty to fulfill. The combat that followed was brief and terrible. 7 men against 3 might seem like overwhelming odds, but these were not ordinary opponents. The 3 Kingsguard were legends, warriors of surpassing skill, armed with the finest weapons and armour, fighting with the desperate courage of men who knew they would not survive but were determined to fulfill their oaths to the last breath. They cut through Ned's companions like death itself, and when the fighting ended, only 2 men remained alive, Ned Stark and Howland Reed. How exactly those 2 survived when 5 others died is a matter that has never been fully explained. The songs say that Ned killed Sir Arthur Dayne, the greatest knight of his age, in single combat, but Ned himself always insisted that he would have died, if not for Howland Reed, that it was Howland who saved his life, though he never specified exactly how. Some whisper that Howland used poison, that he fought in Crannogmen fashion rather than with honour, that he struck from behind or used some trick that allowed Ned to overcome an opponent who should have killed him. Others suggest that Howland might have used greensight, might have known what was coming and positioned himself accordingly, might have seen in dreams or visions exactly what needed to be done. Whatever the truth of how the fight ended, the result was that Ned and Howland stood alive amidst the bodies of their companions and the fallen Kingsguard, and they entered the tower to find what the knights had been guarding. What they found there, in a bed of blood, was Lyanna Stark, dying from complications of childbirth, having just delivered a son. The father of that child was Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, and the child was Jon Snow, though that name would not be his by right of birth. Lyanna, in her final moments, made Ned promise something, made him swear to protect her son, to keep him safe from Robert Baratheon, who would surely kill any Targaryen heir if he learned of the boy's existence. Ned, bound by love for his sister and by the promise he made to her, agreed to raise the child as his own bastard, to hide the boy's true parentage, to carry that secret for the rest of his life no matter what it cost him in terms of honour and reputation. And Howland Reed, who was there, who heard Lyanna's dying words, who helped Ned bury the bodies and dismantle the tower, became the only other living person who knew the truth about Jon Snow's parentage. This secret, this knowledge that Howland carried from the Tower of Joy, was perhaps the most dangerous information in all of Westeros. If it became known that a Targaryen heir lived, that Jon Snow was not Ned Stark's bastard but the legitimate son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, married in secret according to some accounts, it could reignite the civil war, could lead to Jon's death, could destroy the fragile peace that Robert's victory had established. So Howland kept silent, told no one, not even his own family, carried that burden alone for decades. The weight of this secret must have been enormous. Howland had to watch as Jon grew up at Winterfell, treated as a bastard, denied the recognition and honour that should have been his by right. He had to remain silent when others spoke ill of Ned Stark for his supposed infidelity, when Catelyn Stark resented Jon's presence, when the boy struggled with his identity and his place in the world. Every instinct to speak the truth, to defend his friend's honour, to acknowledge Jon's real parentage, had to be suppressed in service of keeping the secret that protected Jon's life. After the Tower of Joy, after the war ended and Robert took the Iron Throne, Howland Reed returned to the Neck and to Greywater Watch. He became Lord Reed in truth when his father died, took up the responsibilities of leading the Crannogmen, resumed the life of managing his people and maintaining the traditions of his house. But he was changed by what he had experienced, by the war and the friendships and the terrible knowledge he carried. Those who knew him said he became more reclusive, that he withdrew from the world beyond the Neck, that he rarely if ever left the swamps after his return. This withdrawal was deliberate and strategic. Howland understood that he was dangerous, that his knowledge made him a target, that anyone seeking to uncover Jon's parentage might eventually think to question the only other survivor of the Tower of Joy. By remaining in the Neck, by staying at Greywater Watch which no one could find, by keeping himself removed from the political machinations of the Seven Kingdoms, Howland protected both himself and the secret he carried. He could not be tortured for information if he could not be found. He could not accidentally reveal what he knew if he never spoke to those who might ask dangerous questions. But Howland's withdrawal was not complete. He maintained his connection to House Stark, his friendship with Ned enduring despite the distance and the years. They corresponded, though what they wrote to each other is not known to us, those letters lost or destroyed. When Ned needed counsel or wanted to discuss matters that required absolute trust, Howland was there, unseen but present, a friend who understood what Ned carried, who shared at least part of the burden. Howland married and had children, though the details of his family life are largely private, kept within the Neck away from the scrutiny of outsiders. He had a daughter named Meera and a son named Jojen, both of whom inherited something of their father's gifts, particularly Jojen, who developed strong greensight, who had prophetic dreams from a young age. Howland raised his children in the Crannogmen way, teaching them the skills and knowledge of their people, but he also prepared them for something, gave them an understanding that they might have roles to play in events beyond the Neck. The years passed, and Howland remained at Greywater Watch, managing his people, defending the Neck, maintaining the ancient compact between House Reed and House Stark. He watched from afar as events unfolded in the Seven Kingdoms, as Robert's reign brought a kind of peace, but also sowed the seeds of future conflicts. He knew things that others did not know, saw patterns that others could not see, perhaps through greensight, or perhaps simply through the wisdom that comes from carrying great secrets and understanding their implications. When the War of the Five Kings began, when Ned Stark was executed in King's Landing, and Robb Stark called the banners to avenge his father and secure northern independence, Howland answered that call as his ancestors had always answered the Starks' calls. But his response was measured and strategic. He sent forces to support Robb's campaign, but he also kept the Neck defended, understood that the security of the north-southern border could not be compromised even in the urgency of war, and he sent his children, Meera and Jojen, to Winterfell with instructions to swear themselves to Bran Stark to protect him, to help him reach his destiny. This decision to send his children north while war raged reveals something about Howland's understanding of events. He knew, through greensight, or through careful observation, that Bran Stark was important, that the boy had a role to play that went beyond the immediate political conflicts. Jojen's dreams had shown him things, had revealed that Bran needed to travel north of the Wall, needed to reach the three-eyed raven, needed to become something more than just another Stark lordling. Howland trusted these visions enough to send his children on what he must have known was a dangerous, possibly fatal mission. Throughout all these years, through all these events, Howland never revealed what he knew about Jon Snow. He watched as Jon joined the Night's Watch, as the boy went to the Wall and took vows that should have made his parentage irrelevant, as events unfolded that might have been different if the truth had been known. But Howland kept his promise to Lyanna and to Ned, understood that some secrets are worth keeping, even when keeping them costs dearly, even when revelation might seem to serve good purposes. The burden of this silence, the weight of knowing something that could change everything but choosing to remain quiet, shaped Howland Reed in ways that are difficult for us to fully understand. He was not just a minor lord from a backward region. He was a keeper of truths that the realm was not ready to hear, a guardian of secrets that protected not just one life, but the fragile peace of kingdoms. His choice to withdraw to Greywater Watch, to remain hidden and inaccessible, was not cowardice, but wisdom, the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is nothing, is to wait, is to trust that the truth will emerge when the time is right rather than forcing it into a world unprepared to receive it. As we contemplate Howland Reed's life, his journey from the Neck to the Isle of Faces to Harrenhal to the Tower of Joy and back to Greywater Watch, we see a man who moved through the margins of great events, who was present at crucial moments but never sought the spotlight, who knew more than almost anyone but said less than almost everyone. He embodies a different kind of heroism than the warriors celebrated in songs, a quieter courage that manifests in keeping faith, in bearing unbearable burdens, in choosing silence when speaking might be easier. Howland Reed is still alive, still at Greywater Watch, still keeping his secrets, still waiting for whatever comes next. And in his waiting, in his patient guardianship of truths too dangerous to speak, he remains one of the most important figures in the story of Ice and Fire, even though his name is rarely spoken, and his face is known to almost no one outside the Neck. The children of Howland Reed grew up in the Neck, raised among the floating granogs and shifting channels of the swamps, learning the ways of the Crannogmen as generations had learned before them. But they were also different from other Crannogmen children, marked by gifts and burdens that set them apart, prepared by their father for roles that would take them far from home, into the wider world where Crannogmen rarely ventured. Meera and Jojen Reed would become central figures in one of the strangest and most important journeys in all of Westeros, a journey that began in duty and friendship but ended in transformation and loss, a journey that would ask everything of them and give back far less than they deserved. Meera Reed was the elder of the two siblings, born in the year 283 after Aegon's conquest, approximately 2 years before her brother. She grew up in Greywater Watch, that mysterious moving castle, under the guidance of her father and the broader community of Crannogmen who made their home in that part of the Neck. From her earliest years, Meera learned the skills that every Crannogman learns: how to move silently through the swamps, how to pole a boat through narrow channels, how to read the subtle signs that indicate safe ground versus deadly quicksand, how to find food and water in an environment that seems hostile to human life. But Meera's training went beyond the basics that all Crannogmen children received. She was being prepared for something, though perhaps she did not fully understand what in her early years. She became exceptionally skilled with the traditional three-pronged frog spear, practicing until she could strike targets with precision that impressed even experienced warriors. She learned to throw nets with such accuracy that she could entangle an opponent before they realized they were under attack. She studied the art of moving unseen, of using terrain and vegetation for concealment, of reading the intentions of potential enemies before they acted. Meera's relationship with her younger brother Jojen was close, in the way that siblings who grow up in relative isolation often are. They depended on each other for companionship, for understanding, for the kind of connection that comes from sharing experiences that others cannot comprehend. But their relationship was also shaped by Jojen's gift, by the green dreams that came to him from a young age, by the burden of prophetic knowledge that made him both precious and vulnerable. Jojen Reed was born with abilities that marked him as special even among the Crannogmen, where green-seeing was more common than elsewhere but still rare. From early childhood, Jojen experienced dreams that were more than dreams, visions that showed him things that had not yet happened, glimpses of possible futures and necessary paths. These green dreams were not always clear or easy to interpret, but they came with a certainty, a weight of truth that could not be denied or dismissed as ordinary nighttime imaginings. The gift of green sight is not an easy one to bear, particularly for a child. Jojen saw things that frightened him, futures that included suffering and death, paths that led to destinations both wondrous and terrible. Among the visions that came to him was the knowledge of his own death, not the exact circumstances perhaps, but the certainty that he would die young, that his life would be short and would end in service to something larger than himself. This knowledge shaped everything about Jojen, gave him a gravity and seriousness unusual in one so young, made him accept mortality in a way that most people never do, even in old age. Howland Reed understood what his son's gift meant, recognized the signs of true greensight, and did what he could to help Jojen navigate the burden. He taught him what he knew about the green dreams, about how to interpret them, about how to live with knowledge of futures that might or might not come to pass. He may have taken Jojen to the Isle of Faces as he himself had once gone, seeking wisdom from the green men who dwelt there, seeking training in the arts that the children of the forest had once practiced. Whether such a journey happened is uncertain, but it would explain how Jojen developed such understanding of his gift at such a young age. The relationship between Meera and Jojen was shaped by their complementary natures. Meera was practical, grounded in the physical world, skilled in the arts of survival and combat. Jojen was mystical, his attention often turned inward to the visions that came to him, less concerned with immediate physical dangers than with the larger patterns he perceived. Meera became her brother's protector, understanding that his gift made him valuable but also vulnerable, that he needed someone to watch over him while his attention was elsewhere. This protective role would define much of her life, would shape her choices and her sacrifices in the years to come. The children grew up hearing stories about their father's friendship with the Starks, about the bonds forged at the tournament at Harrenhal, about the loyalty that House Reed owed to House Stark. They understood that their family was connected to the great events of the realm in ways that most Crannogmen were not, that their father knew things and had experienced things that set him apart. But the specifics, the secrets about what had happened at the Tower of Joy, about Jon Snow's true parentage, these were kept from them, at least in their early years. Some knowledge was too dangerous even for a father to share with his children. When Jojen's green dreams began to show him images of Bran Stark, the young son of Lord Eddard Stark, when the visions revealed that Bran was important, that he had a destiny that needed to be fulfilled, Howland understood that the time was coming when his children would need to leave the Neck. The dream showed that Bran would need help, that he would need guides and protectors, that Meera and Jojen had roles to play in his journey. The timing was delicate, the decision difficult, but Howland trusted his son's visions, trusted that the green dreams were showing true futures rather than false possibilities. The journey to Winterfell, when it came, happened after Bran's fall, after the boy had been crippled and lost the use of his legs, after he had begun to experience his own dreams that he did not understand. Meera and Jojen arrived at Winterfell in the year 299 after Aegon's conquest, at a time when the Stark household was in turmoil, when Robb had gone south to war, when Bran was serving as the acting Lord of Winterfell despite his youth and his disability. The arrival of the Reed children at Winterfell was significant partly because it was so unusual. Crannogmen rarely came to the castle, and when they did, it was typically older warriors or representatives on specific business. For the children of Howland Reed to appear, to present themselves to Bran and offer their service, suggested something important, something that went beyond normal diplomatic or military matters. Bran, though young, understood that this visit meant something, that these strange children from the swamps had come for a reason that was not immediately apparent. Meera and Jojen swore themselves to Bran in the old way, pledging to be his loyal servants, to protect him and to help him however they could. This oath was not just formality or political manoeuvring. It was a genuine commitment, made with full understanding of what it might cost, made because Jojen's dreams had shown that this was necessary, that Bran's path would require their help. For Meera, the oath meant accepting that her life would be dedicated to protecting not just her brother, but also this Stark boy she barely knew. For Jojen, it meant accepting the path that his visions had shown him, the path that led toward his death. The time at Winterfell was relatively brief before the castle fell to Theon Greyjoy's treacherous seizure, before Bran and his younger brother Rickon had to flee into hiding. But during that time, Meera and Jojen began the work of preparing Bran for what was to come. Jojen tried to explain about the green dreams, about the gifts that Bran possessed without fully understanding them, about the importance of the visions that came to him while he slept. It was difficult work, trying to explain mystical concepts to a boy who'd been raised in a culture that was skeptical of such things, even in the north where the old gods were still worshipped. When Winterfell fell and Bran had to escape, Meera and Jojen went with him, along with Hodor, the simple giant of a man who could carry Bran, and Osha, the wildling woman who had been captured earlier. The group fled into the Wolfswood, into the wilderness beyond the castle, beginning a journey that would eventually take them beyond the wall, into the haunted forest, into places where few humans ventured and fewer still returned. This journey north was the defining experience of Meera and Jojen's lives, the test that would reveal their characters, the crucible that would demand everything they had to give. Meera took on the role of hunter and protector, using her skills with spear and net to catch food, using her knowledge of wilderness survival to keep the group alive as they travelled through increasingly hostile terrain. She scouted ahead, watching for dangers, whether human enemies or the more supernatural threats that existed beyond the wall. She stood watch at night, letting others sleep while she remained vigilant. She was, in many ways, the practical foundation that kept the group functioning, that solved the immediate problems of food and shelter and security. Jojen's role was different, more mystical and harder to define. He provided direction, guided by his green dreams, helping to navigate toward their ultimate destination, even when the path was unclear. He encouraged Bran to explore his own abilities, to enter the minds of animals, particularly his direwolf Summer, to understand the gift of skin-changing that he possessed. He explained what he could about the three-eyed raven, the mysterious figure who appeared in both his dreams and Bran's, who was calling them north, who represented some destiny that Bran needed to fulfill. The journey was hard in ways that are difficult to fully convey. They travelled through wild country, sleeping rough, always hungry, always cold, always aware that enemies might be pursuing them. They crossed the wall at the Night Fort, that ancient ruined fortress where legends said terrible things had happened in the distant past. They entered the haunted forest beyond the wall, a place of deep shadows and older powers, where the trees seemed to watch them, where dangers lurked that were not natural or understandable in conventional terms. The relationship between Meera and Jojen was tested by the hardships of the journey. Meera watched her brother grow weaker as they travelled, saw the toll that the visions took on him, saw how he sometimes seemed to be fading. As if part of him was already in some other place, preparing for the death he knew was coming. She tried to keep him strong, to encourage him to eat and rest, to protect him from the worst of the dangers they faced. But she also had to respect his choices, had to accept that he was walking his path with open eyes, that he had chosen this destiny knowing what it would cost. Jojen's acceptance of his approaching death was both admirable and heartbreaking. He did not rage against it or try to avoid it. He simply continued forward, doing what needed to be done, helping Bran develop his abilities, guiding the group toward their destination. There was a quiet courage in this acceptance, a willingness to sacrifice himself for purposes larger than his own survival. But it also created a kind of distance, a sense that part of Jojen was already gone, already separated from the immediate concerns and connections that bind people to life. The group encountered wights beyond the wall, those terrible animated corpses that served the others, the ancient enemy from the long night who had awakened after thousands of years of slumber. The wights attacked at a place called Queen's Crown, and the fight that followed showed both the group's courage and their vulnerability. Bran entered Summer's mind and fought through the direwolf, tearing at the dead flesh of their enemies. Meera used her spear and net, fighting with desperate skill against opponents who felt no pain and could not be easily killed. They survived, but it was close, closer than any of them wanted to contemplate. The journey eventually brought them to a cave, a deep hollow beneath a great weirwood tree, where the three-eyed raven dwelt in his final form. This being, who had once been a human named Brynden called Bloodraven, had lived for more than 100 years, had become one with the weirwood, had waited in this cave for Bran to arrive, to take up the mantle of the next three-eyed raven. The cave was protected by the children of the forest, those ancient beings who most of the world thought were extinct, who used their magic to keep the wights and the others from entering. But reaching the cave required one final terrible cost. The wights attacked as they approached, a massive force of the dead pursuing them through the snow. The group ran for the cave, desperate to reach its safety before the wights overwhelmed them, and in that final dash Summer, Bran's direwolf, sacrificed himself to buy them time, turning to fight the pursuing wights, holding them back long enough for the humans to reach the cave's entrance. The direwolf died there in the snow, torn apart by the wights, his last act one of protection and love. The loss of Summer was devastating for Bran, the severing of a bond that had been central to his identity since the direwolf pup had come into his life. But there was no time to mourn properly, no time to process the loss before they were swept up into the strange reality of the cave, of living with the three-eyed raven and the children of the forest, of beginning the training that would transform Bran into something more and less than human. Life in the cave was surreal, disconnected from time and the normal progression of days and seasons. They were fed by the children, given shelter, kept safe from the enemies beyond. But it was also a kind of imprisonment, a separation from the world that became increasingly absolute as time passed. Bran spent his time learning from the three-eyed raven, entering the weirwood network, seeing across vast distances and through time itself, developing abilities that ordinary humans could not even imagine. Meera and Jojen, having fulfilled their purpose in bringing Bran to this place, found themselves in a strange position. They were needed less and less as Bran became more absorbed in his training, more focused on the visions and the power he was developing. Meera continued to try to be useful, to help however she could, but increasingly she was just watching, just waiting, just existing in this timeless cave while her brother faded and Bran became something alien. The exact fate of Jojen in the cave is uncertain, shrouded in ambiguity and disturbing possibilities. In the books there is a theory, supported by textual hints and symbolic connections, that Jojen died in the cave and that his blood, perhaps even his flesh, was used in a ritual, was mixed with the weirwood paste that Bran consumed as part of his transformation. This possibility, if true, represents a horror that is difficult to contemplate. The idea that Jojen's death was not just accepted, but utilized, that his sacrifice was literal and complete. Whether or not the darkest version of this theory is true, what is certain is that Jojen died, that the green dreams he had experienced throughout his life proved accurate, that his journey ended in that cave beneath the weirwood. For Meera, this loss was devastating. She had protected her brother for their entire lives, had dedicated herself to keeping him safe, and in the end she could not prevent the death that he had always known was coming. The grief of losing Jojen was compounded by the strangeness of the circumstances, by the lack of proper burial or memorial, by the sense that his death had been used for purposes she did not fully understand. After Jojen's death, after Bran's transformation was largely complete, Meera found herself in an impossible position. She had fulfilled her oath to protect Bran, had brought him to his destiny, had lost her brother in the process. But Bran, as he became the three-eyed raven, became increasingly inhuman, increasingly disconnected from the emotional bonds that had once defined him. When Meera tried to connect with him, tried to be acknowledged for the sacrifices she and Jojen had made, Bran responded with cold indifference, seeming barely to remember what they had meant to each other, what they had endured together. This coldness, this dismissal of everything Meera had given, was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. She had lost her brother, had spent years of her life in service to Bran, had endured hardships and terrors that most people could not imagine, and in return she received nothing, not gratitude or recognition, or even simple human warmth. Just the distant acknowledgement from a being who wore Bran's face but was no longer really Bran, who had become something that valued knowledge and power over friendship and loyalty. Meera eventually left the cave, made her way back south, back toward the Neck and Greywater Watch. The journey back was lonely and dangerous, travelling alone through the lands beyond the Wall, through the north torn by war and winter. She carried with her the weight of the loss, the grief for her brother, the sense of abandonment by the boy she had sworn to serve, the question of whether any of it had been worth the cost. When we contemplate Meera and Jojen Reed, we see two young people who are asked to give everything in service of something larger than themselves, who fulfilled that service with courage and dedication, who paid prices that seemed disproportionate to any reward they received. Jojen gave his life, accepted a death he had foreseen, walked willingly into darkness because he believed it was necessary. Meera gave her youth, her brother, years of her life, and received in return only the cold dismissal of the being her charge had become. Their story raises difficult questions about sacrifice and service, about whether dedication to a cause justifies the costs extracted from those who serve it. The Crannogmen way, the values that Howland Reed had instilled in his children, emphasized loyalty and duty, emphasized doing what was right regardless of personal cost. Meera and Jojen embodied these values completely, served them faithfully, and were destroyed by them in ways that seemed profoundly unjust. Yet they never faltered, never abandoned their path, never sought to save themselves at the expense of their duty. There is something both admirable and tragic in this absolute commitment, this willingness to be consumed by service to a destiny that was never really theirs. While Meera and Jojen were undertaking their strange journey north, while they were dedicating themselves to Bran Stark's destiny, their father's people were being drawn into a different kind of conflict, one more conventional in its shape, but no less demanding in its cost. When Robb Stark called his banners after the execution of his father Eddard in King's Landing, when the North rose in rebellion against the Iron Throne and declared its independence from the rule of the boy King Joffrey Baratheon, the Crannogmen answered that call as they had always answered the Stark's summons. The War of the Five Kings would test the Crannogmen in familiar ways, would ask them to employ the tactics and skills they had refined over thousands of years, but it would also reveal the limitations of even the most dedicated service, the ways that loyalty can be both honoured and exploited, the costs that fall heaviest on those least able to bear them. Howland Reed's response to Robb's call to arms was measured and strategic in ways that reflected both his loyalty to House Stark and his responsibility to his own people. He could not empty the neck of defenders, could not leave the southern approaches to the north unguarded even in the urgency of supporting Robb's war. The neck remained the gateway, the choke point that controlled access to northern territory, and if it fell or was left vulnerable, all of Robb's victories elsewhere would be meaningless. So Howland sent forces to support the campaign, but he also maintained sufficient strength in the swamps to ensure that no enemy could march north while the young wolf was occupied in the riverlands. The Crannogmen warriors who marched south to join Robb's army numbered perhaps 300, possibly fewer, a small contingent compared to the thousands that some northern houses contributed. But as had been true throughout history, the Crannogmen's value lay not in their numbers but in their specialised capabilities, in the skills and knowledge that made them uniquely effective in certain kinds of warfare. They came equipped in their traditional manner, with frog spears and nets, with small bows and poisoned arrows, with clothing that let them blend into forest and marsh, with the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of fighting in terrain that defeated conventional armies. These Crannogmen forces did not fight as a single unit under their own commanders, integrated into the larger northern army in the way that most bannermen did. Instead, they were distributed throughout Robb's forces in small groups, assigned to roles that leveraged their particular strengths. Some served as scouts, ranging ahead of the main army, gathering intelligence about enemy positions and movements, using their ability to move unseen to get close to enemy camps and observe without being detected. Others were assigned to protect supply lines, to ensure that the provisions and equipment that kept the army functioning reached their destinations despite enemy attempts at interdiction. The Riverlands, where much of the early fighting in the war took place, provided terrain that the Crannogmen understood well. While it was not the deep swamps of the Neck, it had rivers and streams, marshes and wetlands, forests and rough country where conventional military formations struggled. The Crannogmen moved through this landscape with confidence that amazed the other northern soldiers, finding paths where others saw only impassable obstacles. Locating fords and crossing points that were not marked on any map, reading the land in ways that came from cultural knowledge refined over millennia. One of the Crannogmen's most valuable contributions to Robb's campaign was their work in harassing Lannister supply lines. The Lannister armies, while formidable in open battle, depended on a constant flow of supplies from the Westerlands and from King's Landing. Food, weapons, armour, all of it had to be transported along roads that passed through territory where small groups of skilled raiders could do enormous damage. The Crannogmen specialised in exactly this kind of warfare, striking supply convoys, destroying wagons, poisoning food stores, and vanishing before any response could be organised. These attacks were not random or opportunistic, but carefully planned and coordinated. The Crannogmen scouts would identify vulnerable targets, would observe the patterns of Lannister logistics, would find the points where defences were weakest. Then small teams would strike, moving in at night or during bad weather when visibility was poor, using the terrain for cover, employing tactics that maximise confusion and fear. A convoy of 20 wagons guarded by 50 soldiers might be attacked by a dozen Crannogmen who would strike from the trees or from the high grass beside the road, loose their poisoned arrows, and fade away before the guards could even identify where the attack was coming from. The psychological effect of these attacks was significant. Lannister soldiers began to dread convoy duty, began to see threats in every shadow, began to bunch together for protection in ways that made them less effective at their actual job of guarding supplies. The knowledge that a tiny wound from a Crannogmen arrow meant almost certain death created a fear that was disproportionate to the actual numbers of attackers. Soldiers would obsess over small cuts and scratches, would panic at the first sign of fever, would sometimes refuse to continue their duties out of terror that they had been poisoned. The Crannogmen also proved valuable in gathering intelligence, in learning what the Lannister commanders were planning, what forces were being moved and where they were going. Their ability to infiltrate enemy camps, to observe from hiding, to move through areas that the Lannisters thought were secure, provided Robb with information that shaped his strategic decisions. Knowing where enemy reinforcements were coming from, knowing when supply problems were weakening particular garrisons, knowing the state of enemy morale, all of this intelligence came in part from Crannogmen scouts who risked their lives to gather it. In the actual battles of the campaign, the Crannogmen's role was typically more limited. They were not heavy infantry who could hold a line or shock cavalry who could break enemy formations. In the set-piece battles that decided the war's major campaigns, the Crannogmen often served in supporting roles, protecting flanks, harassing enemy formations with arrow fire, pursuing broken enemies after the main fighting was done. Their skills were most valuable in the smaller engagements, the ambushes and raids and skirmishes that happened between the major battles, the grinding work of attrition that wore down enemy strength over time. One area where the Crannogmen excelled was in fighting in the forested and marshy terrain of the Riverlands. When battles moved into the woods, when fighting happened in areas where visibility was limited and movement was difficult, the Crannogmen's advantages became more pronounced. They could use the trees for cover, could set ambushes that conventional forces would never anticipate, could strike and withdraw before the enemy could bring their superior numbers to bear. There are accounts of small groups of Crannogmen holding up much larger enemy forces in wooded country, inflicting casualties far out of proportion to their numbers through careful positioning and ruthless efficiency. The neck itself played a crucial strategic role throughout the war, even though no major battles were fought there. The Lannisters and their allies never seriously attempted to invade the north through the neck, understanding that the swamps and Moat Cailin made such an invasion effectively impossible. This meant that Robb could campaign in the south with confidence that his homeland was secure, that even if he lost battles in the Riverlands, the north itself would remain inviolate. The Crannogmen who remained in the neck to defend it were thus contributing to Robb's war effort, even though they never saw combat, simply by being present, by maintaining the defences that made invasion unthinkable. The human cost of the war fell heavily on the Crannogmen despite their small numbers. Warfare, even when conducted with skill and intelligence, involves danger and death. Crannogmen scouts were captured by enemy patrols, were tortured for information before being executed. Raiders were caught in ambushes of their own, were killed when attacks went wrong or when the enemy proved more alert than expected. Warriors died of wounds that became infected, of diseases that spread through armies, of simple exhaustion and exposure during long campaigns in harsh conditions. Each death diminished the already small Crannogmen population, removed skills and knowledge that took years to develop, left families and communities grieving losses that could never truly be replaced. The Crannogmen did not have the population base that allowed houses like the Umbers or the Karstarks to absorb heavy casualties and remain effective military forces. Every warrior who died in Robb's service was an irreplaceable loss to his community, a gap that would be felt for generations. The Red Wedding, that infamous massacre where Robb Stark, his mother Catelyn, and much of the Northern Army's leadership were murdered during what was supposed to be a wedding feast, was a catastrophe that affected every northern house, but the Crannogmen were fortunate in one respect. Because their forces were typically distributed in small groups rather than concentrated, because many of them were out on scouting missions or protecting supply lines rather than attending the feast at the Twins, the Crannogmen losses at the Red Wedding itself were relatively light. Most of the Crannogmen warriors survived that night, which meant that House Reed did not lose its military capability in a single terrible blow the way some other northern houses did. But surviving the Red Wedding did not mean escaping the war unscathed. The Crannogmen forces found themselves scattered across the Riverlands, cut off from the main northern army which had been destroyed, uncertain about what to do or where to go. Some attempted to make their way back to the Neck, travelling in small groups through enemy territory, hunted by Lannister and Frey patrols that were scouring the countryside for northern survivors. Others went to ground, hiding in the forests and swamps of the Riverlands, continuing to wage a guerrilla war against the Lannisters and the Freys, even after the larger conflict had been decided. This continuation of resistance after Robb's death showed both the Crannogmen's dedication and their understanding of their own strengths. They could not win the war in any conventional sense, could not defeat the Lannister armies in battle or reclaim the territories that had been lost. But they could make the Lannisters' victory expensive, could continue to harass and raid and kill, could ensure that the enemies who had betrayed and murdered their king paid an ongoing price for their treachery. It was a kind of warfare that the Crannogmen understood deeply, patient and persistent, focused not on decisive victory but on making the enemy's position untenable over time. The neck itself became even more important after the Red Wedding, serving as a refuge for northern survivors who managed to escape the massacre and make their way back toward home. The Crannogmen who controlled the swamps provided safe passage for these refugees, guided them through the maze of channels and bogs, protected them from pursuing enemies. Greywater Watch, that moving castle that could never be found by outsiders, became a symbol of continued northern resistance, a place where the war was not over, where loyalty to the Starks had not been extinguished by betrayal and murder. Howland Reed's leadership during this period was crucial, though it was exercised from the shadows, from the hidden depths of the neck where he remained inaccessible to friend and enemy alike. He coordinated the Crannogmen's continued resistance, maintained communication with other northern lords who remained loyal to the Stark cause, kept alive the hope that eventually the North would be free again, that the traitors would face justice. His experience, his strategic understanding, his knowledge of how to fight wars of attrition against superior forces, all of this guided the Crannogmen through the darkest period of the conflict. The relationship between the Crannogmen and the other northern houses was tested during this period. Some northern lords, seeing the war as lost, made their peace with the new order, bent the knee to the Boltons who had betrayed Robb and been rewarded with the wardenship of the North. Others went into exile or hiding, maintaining their loyalty to the Stark cause but unable to actively resist. The Crannogmen, through Howland's leadership, chose continued resistance, chose to keep the neck closed to Bolton and Lannister forces, chose to maintain the fight even when victory seemed impossible. This choice was costly. The neck suffered from the ongoing conflict, from the diversion of resources to military efforts rather than to the normal activities that sustained Crannogmen communities. The isolation became more complete as the Crannogmen cut themselves off from any cooperation with the new regime, as they rejected the authority of the Boltons and maintained their loyalty to a house that seemed to have been destroyed. But the choice also preserved something important, preserved the principle that loyalty meant something, that oaths were not just words to be abandoned when circumstances became difficult. The guerrilla warfare that the Crannogmen waged in the Riverlands after the Red Wedding took many forms. Some groups focused on continuing to attack supply lines, making it difficult for the Lannister garrisons to maintain themselves in the territories they had conquered. Others targeted isolated Frey forces, exacting revenge for the betrayal of Guestright, making House Frey pay in blood for their violation of the sacred customs of hospitality. Still others simply tried to survive, to avoid capture while making their way back to the neck, to preserve themselves for a future time when the North might rise again. The tactics employed in this phase of the war were classic Crannogmen methods, refined by generations of experience in asymmetric warfare. Ambushes on lonely roads, poisoned wells in enemy-held castles, sentries who disappeared in the night, patrols that rode out and never returned. The Crannogmen made the Riverlands dangerous for the Lannisters and their allies, created an environment where enemy soldiers were never truly safe, where even victory felt uncertain and provisional. The toll this took on the Crannogmen themselves, both physically and psychologically, was significant. Fighting a losing war, engaging in constant violence while cut off from home and family, losing comrades to combat and disease, and the simple grinding attrition of guerrilla warfare, all of this wore away at morale and cohesion. Some Crannogmen warriors died of their wounds far from home, were buried in foreign soil by comrades who might not survive to carry news of their deaths back to the neck. Others simply disappeared, lost in the chaos of war, their fates unknown to this day. The few Crannogmen who were captured faced particular dangers. The Lannisters and Freys knew that Crannogmen were skilled in poisoncraft, were likely to attempt escape if given any opportunity, were valuable sources of intelligence about northern resistance activities. Captured Crannogmen were often tortured, interrogated brutally in attempts to extract information about Howland Reed's location, about the movements of other northern forces, about the defences of the neck. Most refused to betray their people, endured the torture in silence or with defiance, died without giving their captors the intelligence they sought. The war also affected the neck directly, even though no major battles were fought there. The closing of the neck to all traffic, the total isolation that the Crannogmen imposed, meant that trade goods that had once moved north and south through the swamps no longer flowed. the small amount of economic exchange that had existed between the Neck and other regions ceased. The Crannogmen became even more dependent on their own resources, even more self-sufficient and isolated than they had been before the war. As the war ground on, as the initial phases gave way to the longer, more complex conflicts that followed, the Crannogmen's role evolved. They continued to maintain the Neck as an impassable barrier, continued to wage their guerrilla campaign in the Riverlands, but they also began to look ahead, to think about what would come after, about how the North might be restored, about what role they would play in whatever new order eventually emerged. Howland Reed, with his unique knowledge about Jon Snow's parentage, with his understanding of the deeper currents of Westerosi politics, was positioned to play a significant role in shaping that future, though when and how he would choose to act remained uncertain. The Crannogmen's service during the War of the Five Kings exemplified both the strengths and the limitations of their approach to warfare. They were superb at the specialised tasks they undertook, at guerrilla warfare and intelligence gathering, and the defence of difficult terrain. They punched far above their weight in terms of military effectiveness, accomplished objectives that would have required much larger forces if attempted by conventional armies. But they could not win the war on their own, could not change the fundamental strategic situation through their efforts alone. They were force multipliers, valuable components of a larger military effort, but not sufficient by themselves to achieve victory. The cost they paid, measured in lives lost and communities disrupted, and resources diverted from normal pursuits, was significant relative to their small population. The Crannogmen emerged from the war diminished, having lost warriors and skills that would take generations to replace if they could be replaced at all. But they also emerged with their honour intact, with their loyalty to the Starks uncompromised, with the knowledge that they had done everything that could be expected of them and more. They had kept faith when others had broken it, had maintained their resistance when others had given up, had preserved the principle that some things mattered more than survival or advantage. As we contemplate the Crannogmen's role in the War of the Five Kings, we might reflect on the nature of service and sacrifice, on what it means to fight for a cause that seems lost, to maintain loyalty in the face of overwhelming odds. The Crannogmen did not win the war, did not save Robb Stark or prevent the disasters that befell the North, but they did what they had always done, what their culture and their history had prepared them to do. They defended their homeland, they supported their liege lords, they fought with skill and courage against enemies who underestimated them, and in doing so they preserved something essential about who they were, maintained the traditions and the identity that made them Crannogmen rather than just another group of Northerners. The war changed them, diminished them in some ways, but it did not break them, did not make them abandon the principles that had sustained their people through thousands of years of history. Beyond the military skills and the political loyalties, beyond the stories of battles and betrayals, the Crannogmen possess something that is perhaps more valuable and certainly more rare in the world of Westeros, a body of knowledge and wisdom that stretches back to times that even the Meisters cannot fully document, understanding that comes from thousands of years of living in intimate relationship with a particular landscape and the powers that dwell within it. This knowledge is practical and mystical both, grounded in careful observation of the natural world, but also open to experiences and explanations that the rational mind struggles to accommodate. To understand what the Crannogmen know, what they carry in their collective memory and pass from generation to generation, is to glimpse an alternative way of being in the world, one that the dominant cultures of Westeros have largely forgotten or deliberately rejected. The foundation of Crannogmen knowledge is their relationship with the swamps of the Neck, an understanding of that ecosystem so deep and comprehensive that it seems almost supernatural to outsiders. Every Crannogman child grows up learning to read the swamp, to interpret the countless subtle signs that indicate what is happening in that complex environment. They learn to distinguish between the calls of different birds, understanding which songs mean that predators are near, which indicate that a storm is approaching, which suggests that humans are moving through the area. They learn to read water, to see in the patterns of current and ripple information about depth and obstacles, about whether lizard lions are lurking below the surface, about which channels are navigable and which lead to dead ends or dangerous areas. This knowledge is not written down in books or recorded in systematic catalogues. It is carried in memory and in practice skill, demonstrated through action and observation, passed from experienced adults to children, through a process of apprenticeship that begins almost from birth. A Crannogman child learns by doing, by following parents and elders through the swamp, by attempting tasks under supervision and guidance, by making mistakes in controlled circumstances where errors are learning opportunities rather than fatal disasters. The knowledge is experiential and embodied, living in the hands and eyes and instincts of practitioners rather than in texts that could be studied theoretically. The Crannogmen's knowledge of plants is particularly extensive and sophisticated. The swamps of the Neck contain countless species of vegetation, many of which exist nowhere else in Westeros, species that have adapted to the unique conditions of the wetlands. The Crannogmen have learned which plants are edible and which are poisonous, which can be used for medicine and which for other purposes like dyeing fabric or waterproofing leather. They know the seasons when each plant is most potent, the parts that should be harvested and the parts that should be left alone, the combinations that enhance effects and the combinations that neutralize them. Among the most important plant knowledge is the understanding of medicinal herbs, the species that can treat the various ailments that afflict humans living in the swamp's challenging environment. The Crannogmen know plants that can reduce fever, that can fight infection, that can ease pain or promote healing of wounds. They know how to prepare these medicines, whether they should be made into teas or poultices or tinctures, what dosages are appropriate for different ages and conditions, what signs indicate that a treatment is working or that it needs to be adjusted. This herbal knowledge extends to treating the specific diseases that are endemic to the Neck, the fevers that come from drinking bad water or from the bites of the countless insects that swarm in the wetlands. The Crannogmen have developed treatments for these conditions that are far more effective than anything the Maesters of the Citadel could provide, because the Crannogmen's knowledge is based on thousands of years of direct experience treating these specific illnesses in this specific environment, whereas the Maesters' knowledge is more general, based on texts and theories that may not apply well to the Neck's unique conditions. The flip side of medicinal knowledge is the Crannogmen's notorious skill with poisons, their understanding of the plants and animals that produce toxic substances, and how those substances can be used as weapons. The Neck is home to numerous poisonous species, snakes whose venom can kill in hours, frogs whose skin secretes toxins that cause paralysis or hallucinations, plants whose leaves or berries or roots contain compounds deadly to humans. The Crannogmen have catalogued all of these, have experimented over countless generations to understand their effects, have learned how to extract and concentrate the active poisons, how to combine different toxins to create new effects. This poison knowledge is carefully guarded past only to those who are deemed trustworthy, who understand the responsibility that comes with such dangerous information. A Crannogman who knows poisons knows how to kill invisibly, how to incapacitate without leaving obvious traces, how to create fear and uncertainty in enemies who know that any wound might be venomed. But they also know the antidotes when antidotes exist, know how to treat poisoning, know the thin line between a dose that kills and a dose that merely sickens. The Crannogmen's understanding of the swamp's animal life is equally comprehensive. They know the behaviours of the lizard lions, those massive predators that are the Neck's most dangerous fauna. They know where lizard lions hunt and when, know how to read the signs of their presence in disturbed vegetation or unusual water movements, know how to avoid them and how to hunt them when necessary. They know that lizard lions are more aggressive during mating season, that they are territorial and will defend certain pools against all intruders, that they can move with surprising speed on land when motivated. They know the countless species of frogs that inhabit the swamps, can identify them by their calls, know which are good eating and which are poisonous, know their seasonal patterns and breeding behaviours. They know the snakes, both the harmless water snakes that are common throughout the Neck and the venomous species that must be avoided or killed on sight. They know the birds, both the year-round residents and the migrants that pass through during their seasonal movements, know where they nest and what they eat, and how their presence indicates changes in the swamp's ecology. This knowledge of animal behaviour extends to more subtle observations, to understanding how the various species interact with each other and with the environment. The Crannogmen know that certain birds follow lizard lions to feed on the insects that swarm around the reptiles, know that the presence of particular fish species indicates good water quality, know that changes in frog populations can signal broader environmental shifts. They understand the swamp as an interconnected system, rather than as a collection of separate elements, see the patterns and relationships that bind the ecosystem together. The Crannogmen's relationship with the old gods and the practice of their religion involves knowledge and experiences that go beyond what is common even in the north, where worship of the weirwoods persists more strongly than in the southern kingdoms. The Crannogmen maintain that their connection to the old gods is deeper and more direct than what most Northmen experience, that their blood carries something from the children of the forest who first taught humans to revere the carved faces in the weirwood trees, who showed them how to listen to the voices in the wind and the whispers in the leaves. Greensight, the ability to have prophetic dreams and to see events distant in space or time, appears more frequently among the Crannogmen than in any other human population in Westeros. While still rare in absolute terms, perhaps 1 in every few hundred Crannogmen possesses some degree of the gift, compared to the 1 in thousands or tens of thousands that might be expected among other populations. This higher incidence suggests something different in Crannogmen lineage, perhaps genuine genetic inheritance from the children of the forest, perhaps some other factor that concentrates the trait in this isolated population. Those Crannogmen who possess green sight are recognized from young ages, identified through the dreams they report, through behaviors that suggest they are seeing things others cannot see. They are given special training, taught how to interpret their visions, how to distinguish true prophetic dreams from ordinary nightmares, how to navigate the strange experience of perceiving time in non-linear ways. The knowledge of how to train greenseers is itself a form of wisdom carried by the Crannogmen, passed down from older seers to younger ones, refined across generations of practice. The content of green dreams is varied and often difficult to interpret. Greenseers might see events that will happen tomorrow, or events that will happen years in the future. They might see symbolic representations rather than literal images, requiring interpretation and wisdom to understand what the visions are actually showing. They might see multiple possible futures, different paths that events could take depending on choices not yet made. Learning to work with this gift, to use it effectively without being overwhelmed by it, requires both natural talent and careful teaching. Some Crannogmen greenseers develop abilities beyond prophetic dreams. They learn to enter the minds of animals, to see through the eyes of birds or swim through the consciousness of fish, to experience the world through sensory systems very different from human ones. This skin-changing ability, as it is called, is closely related to greensight. Perhaps different manifestations of the same underlying gift. The Crannogmen who can skin change use their ability for practical purposes, sending their consciousness into birds to scout distant areas, entering fish to search underwater, using animals as extensions of their own senses. The most advanced practitioners of these arts can connect with the weirwood trees themselves, can enter the network of roots and consciousness that links all the weirwoods across Westeros, can see through the carved faces as if they were eyes, can access memories stored in the wood from thousands of years of observation. This highest level of ability is extremely rare, perhaps only appearing once in many generations, but it represents a form of knowledge and power that is almost godlike. The ability to witness history directly, to see across vast distances, to understand patterns that span centuries. The Crannogmen's spiritual practices include rituals and observances that are distinct from the more formal worship, common in other parts of the north. They make offerings to the weirwoods, not expensive goods, but things from the swamp itself, perfect flowers or unusually shaped stones or water from sacred springs. They sing songs in what might be the old tongue, the language of the first men, or might be something even older, words whose meanings have been lost but whose sounds are preserved through countless repetitions. They conduct ceremonies at particular times of year, marking solstices and equinoxes, celebrating the turning of seasons in ways that connect them to cycles much older than the recorded history of Westeros. These spiritual practices are not separate from their practical knowledge, but woven together with it. The same herbs that are used for medicine might also be burned as offerings to the old gods. The observation of animal behavior that guides hunting also carries spiritual significance, understanding the patterns of life and death, the ways that all things are connected in cycles of consumption and renewal. The Crannogmen do not divide the world into sacred and profane, spiritual and material, but see all of existence as infused with meaning, all of life as participation in something larger than individual survival. The Crannogmen's understanding of time itself seems different from the linear progression that most Westerosi take for granted. Perhaps this comes from their connection to the weirwoods, which can show past and future simultaneously. Perhaps it comes from living in an environment where the landscape is constantly changing, yet somehow always remains the same, where the familiar landmarks shift, but the essential character of the swamp persists across generations. Whatever the source, Crannogmen often speak of time in ways that confuse outsiders, referring to events from centuries ago as if they are recent, connecting current situations to ancient patterns, seeing the present moment as part of cycles that have repeated countless times before. This different relationship with time affects how knowledge is preserved and transmitted. The Crannogmen do not organize their history chronologically in the way that maesters do, creating timelines and dating events precisely. Instead, they organize knowledge thematically and relationally, preserving information based on its usefulness and its connection to enduring patterns. A story about an ancestor from 500 years ago might be told in the same breath as a story about something that happened last year, if both stories illustrate the same principle or teach the same lesson. The practical skills that Crannogmen possess are themselves a form of knowledge, embodied understanding that cannot easily be put into words. The ability to pole a boat through narrow channels without creating sound, to throw a net with perfect accuracy, to move through dense vegetation without disturbing it, to remain motionless in uncomfortable positions for hours, all of these skills are learned through practice and demonstration, carried in muscle memory and refined instinct. A Crannogman who is skilled at these arts possesses knowledge that is valuable and sophisticated, even though it might not be recognized as such by those who value only written learning. The Crannogmen's knowledge of the next geography, their mental maps of the swamp's channels and islands and landmarks, is extraordinarily detailed and constantly updated. They know which routes are passable in different seasons, which areas flood during heavy rains, which channels have silted in or changed course. This knowledge is shared among the communities, communicated through regular contact and through the stories and songs that carry information in memorable forms. A Crannogman can navigate to any part of the neck, can find specific locations that have no fixed position, can maintain orientation in fog or darkness using cues that outsiders would never notice. The erosion of this knowledge, the ways in which it is being lost or diluted, is a source of concern for the older generation of Crannogmen. The younger people, influenced by contact with the outside world, sometimes question the old ways, wonder if traditional knowledge is as valuable as it once was, are tempted by the lure of more conventional education and opportunities. The war that drew Crannogmen warriors away from the neck, that killed skilled practitioners before they could fully pass on what they knew, accelerated this erosion, creating gaps in the transmission of knowledge that may never be filled. Some specific arts are in danger of being lost entirely. The making of certain traditional items, crafted in ways that have been handed down for generations, is known now by only a few elderly artisans. The songs in the old tongue are remembered by fewer and fewer singers. The most sophisticated herbal medicines, those that require rare ingredients and complex preparation, are made by only a handful of people who guard the knowledge jealously, perhaps too jealously, for effective transmission to the next generation. The deep green-seeing abilities that allow connection with the weirwood network have not appeared in several generations, suggesting that this highest form of the gift might be dying out entirely. The relationship between the Crannogmen's traditional knowledge and the more systematic learning of the maesters is complex and sometimes contentious. The maesters, with their emphasis on written records and rational explanation, often dismiss Crannogmen knowledge as superstition or primitive folklore, failing to recognize the sophisticated understanding embedded in practices that have been refined over thousands of years. The Crannogmen, for their part, are often skeptical of maester learning, seeing it as disconnected from practical reality, useful perhaps for abstract understanding but insufficient for actually living in and with the natural world. Yet there are areas where the two knowledge systems could potentially complement each other, where the master's systematic approach and the Crannogmen's experiential wisdom could combine to create something more powerful than either alone. A maester who truly studied Crannogmen herbal medicine, who approached it with respect and genuine interest rather than dismissive skepticism, might be able to identify active compounds, test them systematically, extend their application beyond the neck. A Crannogman who learned to read and write might be able to preserve knowledge in forms that could survive the deaths of individual practitioners, creating a library of swamp lore that could benefit future generations. But such collaborations are rare, hindered by mutual suspicion, and by the fundamental incompatibility of worldviews. The masters see knowledge as something to be collected and catalogued, studied objectively, separated from the cultural and spiritual contexts in which it was developed. The Crannogmen see knowledge as inseparable from practice and relationship, as something that lives in communities and in the bonds between people and place, as diminished rather than enhanced by reduction to written formulas and abstract principles. The Crannogmen's knowledge of their own history, carried in oral tradition and in the memories of their oldest members, extends back into periods that the Meisters can only speculate about. They remember things about the Age of Heroes that are not recorded in any written source, stories about the Long Night and the others that contain details and perspectives missing from the official histories. They remember the pact between the Children of the Forest and the First Men in ways that suggest their ancestors were present, were participants rather than just observers. They remember migrations and conflicts and alliances from thousands of years ago, preserved in songs and stories that have been passed down through countless generations. Whether all of this remembered history is accurate is impossible to determine. Memory changes over time, stories are embellished or simplified, details are lost or invented. But the Crannogmen maintain that their oral traditions preserve essential truths even if specific facts have been altered, that the songs and stories carry wisdom about how to live, about the patterns that repeat across history, about the relationships between humans and the powers that are older than humanity. And perhaps that is the more important question, not whether every detail is historically accurate, but whether the knowledge serves its purpose, whether it helps the Crannogmen navigate their world and maintain their identity. As we contemplate the Crannogmen's knowledge and wisdom, we might recognize that what they possess is not just information but a way of being in the world, a relationship with their environment, and with powers beyond the material that has been cultivated and refined across millennia. This knowledge is threatened, both by the violence that has taken the lives of those who carried it, and by the cultural changes that make younger generations less interested in learning the old ways. The loss of this knowledge would be more than just the disappearance of interesting folklore or useful techniques for living in swamps. It would be the extinction of a way of understanding existence itself, a perspective that holds alternatives to the dominant worldviews of Westeros, possibilities for how humans might relate to nature and to mystery and to time itself. Whether this knowledge can survive, whether it can be preserved and transmitted to future generations, remains uncertain. But its value, both practical and spiritual, is immeasurable. If you're finding these contemplative explorations of Westerosi history and politics a peaceful way to end your day, a like and subscribe really helps others discover these gentle journeys through the past. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of those who find comfort in slowly unfolding stories of power and patience, of roses growing strong through centuries of careful cultivation. The preservation of ancient knowledge brings us naturally to contemplating the present state of the Crannogmen and their uncertain future, to considering where they stand after all the upheavals of recent years, after wars and losses and the slow erosion of traditions that have sustained them since time beyond memory. The Crannogmen exist now in a moment of transition and uncertainty, carrying forward their long history while facing challenges that are both familiar and entirely new, maintaining their identity in a world that is changing in ways that even their greenseers might struggle to fully comprehend. To understand where the Crannogmen might be headed, we need to look carefully at where they are now, at the forces shaping their present, and the choices that will determine their future. The population of the Crannogmen has never been large, and the recent conflicts have diminished it further in ways that will take generations to recover from, if recovery is even possible. The exact numbers are unknown, as the Crannogmen do not conduct censuses or maintain written records of births and deaths, but estimates suggest that perhaps 10,000 people total identify as Crannogmen, scattered across the vast expanse of the Neck in small communities that rarely exceed a few dozen families each. This small population base makes every loss significant, makes the deaths of skilled practitioners or fertile young adults matters of community concern, creates a vulnerability that larger populations do not face. The War of the Five Kings took its toll in lives lost, warriors who died fighting for Robb Stark who will never return to their families and their communities. But perhaps more significantly, it took a toll in disruption, in the interruption of normal life that happens when a society mobilizes for war. Young people who should have been learning traditional skills were instead learning how to fight and kill, Families who should have been fishing and foraging were instead worrying about sons and daughters far away in the riverlands. The rhythms of life that had persisted for thousands of years were broken, and restoring them is proving difficult. The neck itself has been affected by the conflicts, though not through direct battle damage in most areas. The heightened security, the closing of the region to all outsiders, the constant vigilance against potential invasion, all of this has required resources and attention that might otherwise have gone to maintaining the settlements and the infrastructure such as it exists that supports Crannogmen life. Some of the channels that were kept clear for navigation have become choked with vegetation. Some of the Crannogs, those floating settlements, have fallen into disrepair for lack of maintenance. The war created needs that had to be prioritised over everything else, and the consequences of that prioritisation are becoming apparent now. House Reed continues to lead the Crannogmen from Greywater Watch, but the house itself has been diminished by recent events. Howland Reed remains Lord, still hidden somewhere in the moving castle, still keeping the secrets he has carried since the Tower of Joy, still maintaining the defence of the neck and the loyalty to House Stark that has defined his family for generations. But he has lost both of his children to the wider world, to destinies that took them far from home, and gave them back either changed beyond recognition, or not at all. Jojen is dead, his sacrifice made in service to Bran Stark's transformation into the three-eyed raven. Meera has returned, but she is not the same person who left, is carrying grief and disillusionment that may never fully heal. The question of succession within House Reed has become uncertain in ways that create anxiety for those who think about the future. Howland is not young, and the stresses of recent years, the loss of his children, the burden of the secrets he carries, all of this has taken a toll. When he dies, who will lead House Reed? Who will speak for the Crannogmen to the Starks and to the wider north? Meera is the obvious choice as the surviving child, but whether she will accept that role, whether she has the will to take up leadership after everything she has endured, remains unclear. And if she does not, if she chooses to withdraw or proves unable to lead, then the succession becomes uncertain. Might lead to conflict or confusion at a time when the Crannogmen can ill afford such disruption. The strategic importance of the neck persists regardless of the political changes that have swept through Westeros. The swamps remain the gateway to the north, the choke point that any southern army must pass through if they wish to invade northern territory. Moat Cailin, even in its ruined state, remains a formidable obstacle when defended. The Crannogmen's ability to make the neck impassable continues to be one of the North's greatest defensive assets, worth more than thousands of conventional soldiers, worth more than castles or gold or any other resource. But this strategic importance also makes the Crannogmen vulnerable in ways that are sometimes overlooked. Any enemy who wishes to conquer the North must either find a way to neutralise the neck or must accept that invasion is impossible. This creates incentives to develop strategies specifically targeting the Crannogmen, to find ways to bypass or overwhelm their defences, to eliminate House Reed and break the Crannogmen's ability to coordinate their resistance. The neck has held for thousands of years, but that does not guarantee it will hold forever, particularly if enemies develop new tactics or if circumstances change in unexpected ways. The relationship between the Crannogmen and the restored Stark rule in the north, assuming the Starks do regain control after the chaos of recent years, will be crucial to determining the Crannogmen's future. The ancient alliance between House Reed and House Stark has been maintained through countless generations, tested by wars and upheavals but never broken. But alliances must be renewed in each generation, must be made relevant to new circumstances, must serve the needs of both parties, or they become mere formalities that will eventually collapse under pressure. The Crannogmen will expect that a restored Stark regime will honour the traditional autonomy that House Reed has always enjoyed, will not attempt to impose Southern-style feudalism on the neck, will not demand more than the Crannogmen can reasonably provide in terms of taxation or military service. They will expect respect for their culture and their ways, recognition that they are different from other Northerners and that this difference should be accommodated rather than eliminated. Whether future Stark Lords will be willing and able to maintain this delicate balance, or whether they will seek to consolidate power in ways that reduce regional autonomy, remains to be seen. Howland Reed's knowledge about Jon Snow's parentage remains one of the most significant secrets in all of Westeros. a piece of information that could reshape the political landscape if revealed at the right time and in the right way. Throughout all the years since the Tower of Joy, Howland has kept this secret, has watched events unfold while remaining silent, has trusted that the time would come when the truth needed to be spoken. That time may be approaching now as circumstances evolve in ways that could make Jon's Targaryen heritage relevant to the succession of the Iron Throne, to the question of who has the right to rule the Seven Kingdoms. But revealing such a secret is fraught with danger and complexity. Howland would need to come out of hiding, would need to make himself vulnerable to questioning and potential retaliation. He would need to provide evidence that would convince skeptics, would need to navigate the political implications of upending everyone's understanding of Jon's identity. And he would need to consider Jon's own wishes, whether the revelation would help or harm the man who has lived his entire life believing himself to be Ned Stark's bastard, whether Jon would welcome the knowledge of his true parentage or resent having it thrust upon him. The decision about when and whether to reveal this secret will likely be one of the most important choices Howland Reed ever makes, with consequences that extend far beyond the neck, that could affect the entire future of Westeros. His wisdom, his judgment, his understanding of the deeper patterns of events, all of this will be tested. And the Crannogmen, through their lord's knowledge and through his choices, will play a role in shaping the future of the Seven Kingdoms that is disproportionate to their small numbers and their isolated position. The cultural preservation challenges facing the Crannogmen are perhaps more existential than the political or military threats they face. The younger generation, exposed to the wider world through military service, through the stories that returning warriors bring back, through the slow increase in contact with outside cultures, is questioning the old ways in ways that previous generations did not. Why should they live in floating settlements when other people have solid houses? Why should they preserve skills that seem to have no value outside the neck? Why should they maintain isolation when the wider world offers opportunities and experiences that the swamps cannot provide? These questions do not have easy answers. The Crannogmen way of life is adapted to very specific circumstances, to living in the neck's unique environment. The skills and knowledge that allow them to thrive in the swamps are not easily transferable to other contexts, would not be valued or useful if the Crannogmen attempted to integrate fully into mainstream northern society. A Crannogman who left the neck to live in a town or city would find that most of what they knew, most of what made them competent and capable in their home environment, was irrelevant or even disadvantageous in the new setting. But the pull of the outside world, the sense that there must be something more than the hard life in the swamps, is real and understandable. Young people see the possibilities that exist beyond the neck, hear stories of adventures and opportunities, feel confined by the limitations of their small, isolated communities. Some will leave, seeking better lives elsewhere, and with each departure the Crannogmen population shrinks a little more. The transmission of traditional knowledge becomes a little more difficult. The viability of the culture becomes a little more uncertain. The climate and environmental changes that affect all of Westeros also touch the neck, though in ways that are different from their impact on other regions. The long seasons, the unpredictable weather patterns, the subtle shifts in temperature and precipitation that characterize recent years, all of these affect the ecology of the swamps. Water levels change in ways that make some traditional routes impassable and open new channels elsewhere. Plant and animal populations shift, responding to conditions in ways that the Crannogmen observe but cannot entirely predict or control. The ecosystem that the Crannogmen have learned to navigate over thousands of years is changing, requiring adaptation and new learning. Some elders among the Crannogmen speak of visions and dreams that suggest greater changes are coming, transformations that will test the people and the land in ways that history has not prepared them for. The Greenseers see images that they struggle to interpret, glimpses of futures where the neck might look very different from how it has looked for millennia. Whether these visions refer to climate change, to military threats, to social transformations, or to something else entirely, is uncertain. But the sense of approaching change, of a world on the cusp of fundamental transformation, is widespread among those who pay attention to such things. The role that the Crannogmen might play in the conflicts that seem to be building, in the wars and upheavals that many sense are approaching, is unclear. Their traditional strengths remain relevant. Their ability to defend the neck, their skills in guerrilla warfare, their knowledge of poison and stealth. But the nature of the threats facing Westeros may be changing. may be shifting from conventional political and military conflicts to something stranger and more dangerous, to the return of the others and the long winter that the old stories warned about, to magical threats that cannot be defeated through conventional means. If the long night truly is returning, if the others are awakening after thousands of years of dormancy, then the Crannogmen's ancient knowledge, their connection to the old gods and the children of the forest, their memories of the first long night, all of this might be more valuable than anyone currently realizes. The Crannogmen remember things about the others that have been forgotten elsewhere, preserve in their songs and stories warnings and wisdom from the Age of Heroes. They know about the weirwoods and the power that dwells in them, know about the green men of the Isle of Faces who might hold knowledge crucial to fighting the ancient enemy. The green seers among the Crannogmen, those few who possess the gift of prophetic dreams and connection to the weirwood network, might be called upon to play roles in the coming conflicts that go beyond anything their people have done in recorded history. Their ability to see across distances, to communicate through the trees, to perceive patterns invisible to ordinary sight, could be crucial to coordinating resistance against threats that span the continent. But this would require the Crannogmen to emerge from their isolation, to share their knowledge and their gifts with the wider world, to become visible and vulnerable in ways they have carefully avoided for generations. The question of contact with the outside world, of how much the Crannogmen should engage with the broader politics and culture of Westeros versus how much they should maintain their isolation and autonomy, is one that each generation must answer anew. The default position for centuries has been minimal contact, engagement only when necessary to fulfill obligations to House Stark, otherwise deliberate withdrawal into the next protective obscurity. But this isolation has costs as well as benefits, makes the Crannogmen peripheral to events that might affect them, limits their ability to influence outcomes, allows others to make decisions that impact the neck without Crannogmen input. A more engaged approach, one where the Crannogmen participated more actively in northern politics, where they sent representatives to councils and gatherings, where they shared their knowledge more widely, could increase their influence and ensure that their interests were considered in regional decision-making. But it would also expose them to outside pressures, to demands that they change their ways, to the slow erosion of cultural distinctiveness that comes from increased contact with dominant cultures. The balance between isolation and engagement is delicate, and different people within Crannogmen society have different views about where that balance should lie. The economic situation of the Crannogmen remains as it has always been, which is to say marginal by the standards of the wider world but sustainable within their own context. They do not produce surplus goods for trade, do not accumulate wealth in forms that the rest of Westeros would recognise. They live essentially at subsistence level, taking from the swamp what they need to survive and little more. This economic marginality has protected them in some ways, has meant that no one covets the neck for its resources, that there is no economic incentive for conquest or exploitation. But it also means that the Crannogmen have no cushion, no reserves to draw on in times of crisis, no ability to purchase solutions to problems that arise. When disease strikes a community, when a settlement is destroyed by storm or other disaster, when people need help that cannot be provided locally, there are limited options. The wider Crannogmen network can help to some degree, communities supporting each other through difficult times, but the overall poverty of the population means that even collective assistance has limits. The relationship between the Crannogmen and the land itself, the spiritual and practical bonds that tie them to the neck, remains the foundation of their identity and their way of life. As long as those bonds remain strong, as long as each generation learns to read the swamp and live within its rhythms, the Crannogmen will persist in recognisable form. But if those bonds weaken, if younger people lose interest in learning the old skills, if the connection to place and tradition fades, then the Crannogmen might cease to exist as a distinct culture, even if individuals who identify as Crannogmen continue to live in the neck. This cultural continuity depends on choices that are being made now and will be made in the coming years. Will parents insist that children learn the traditional skills, or will they allow those skills to be forgotten in favour of more modern education? Will the communities maintain their distinctive practices and beliefs, or will they gradually adopt the customs of mainstream northern culture? Will the greenseers continue to emerge and be trained, or will that gift fade from the bloodline? Will the songs and stories be passed down faithfully, or will they be lost or transformed beyond recognition? The answers to these questions will determine whether the Crannogmen of the future bear any meaningful resemblance to the Crannogmen of the past, whether the culture that has persisted for thousands of years will survive another generation. The threats are real, the pressures toward assimilation and cultural loss are strong. But so too is the Crannogmen's attachment to their way of life, their pride in their distinctiveness, their understanding that what they possess is valuable even if the rest of the world does not recognize that value. Howland Reed's eventual revelation of Jon Snow's parentage, whenever and however that occurs, will likely have implications for the Crannogmen that extend beyond the immediate political consequences. It will establish House Reed as holders of crucial information as players in the Game of Thrones despite their isolation and their small numbers. It will bring attention to the Neck and to the Crannogmen in ways that could be beneficial or dangerous or both. It will require Howland to explain how he came to possess this knowledge, to tell the story of the Tower of Joy, to reveal aspects of recent history that have been hidden for decades. This increased visibility could be an opportunity for the Crannogmen to have their concerns heard, to secure commitments from whoever ultimately rules about respecting their autonomy and their culture, but it could also make them targets, could expose them to scrutiny and demands that they have successfully avoided through obscurity. The consequences are unpredictable, could unfold in ways that even the Greenseers cannot fully foresee. As we contemplate the Crannogmen's current state and uncertain future, we see a people at a crossroads, carrying forward an ancient heritage while facing challenges that threaten to overwhelm or transform them beyond recognition. They have survived for thousands of years through adaptation and resilience, through their deep connection to the Neck and to the knowledge that allows them to thrive in that difficult environment. They have maintained their identity and their independence through careful management of their relationship with the wider world, engaging when necessary, but always preserving their essential distinctiveness. Whether they can continue to do so, whether the Crannogmen of the future will still be recognizably the same people as the Crannogmen of the past, depends on choices being made now and on circumstances beyond anyone's control. The world is changing in fundamental ways. The old certainties are breaking down, new threats and new possibilities are emerging. The Crannogmen will have to navigate these changes with wisdom and courage, will have to find ways to preserve what is essential while adapting to new realities, will have to honour their past while building a future that their ancestors could not have imagined. The Neck remains, the swamps and channels and floating islands, continuing their eternal dance of water and earth. The weirwood still stand, their carved faces still watching, still holding memories of ages past and visions of ages to come. The Crannogmen still move through their homeland with practiced skill, still know the secrets of the swamp, still maintain the vigil that their ancestors began in the Dawn Age. How long this will continue, how the story will unfold, what role the Crannogmen will play in the great events that are approaching, these questions remain open, unanswered, waiting for time to reveal what even the Greenseers can only glimpse in fragmentary dreams. We've travelled together through the mists of the Neck, through the hidden world of the Crannogmen, through stories of a people who chose to remain small and strong rather than large and scattered, who found power in knowledge rather than in gold or steel. We've met Howland Reed and his children, seen how loyalty and sacrifice shape lives in ways both beautiful and heartbreaking. We've walked through swamps where the old magic still lingers, where Greenseers dream of futures yet unwritten, where the line between the natural and the supernatural blurs like mist over water. The Crannogmen remain in their Neck, keeping their vigil, holding their secrets, waiting for whatever comes next. Their story is not finished, cannot be finished as long as water flows through channels and weirwoods stand with their carved faces watching. They endure as they have always endured through wisdom and patience and the deep knowledge that some things matter more than comfort or recognition. As you drift now into sleep, into your own dreams and visions, carry with you the image of the Neck at twilight, when the water reflects the darkening sky, when the mist rises soft and grey, when everything is quiet and peaceful and timeless. The watch continues, but for you, for now, there is only rest. The swamp whispers its ancient secrets to those who know how to listen, and in the silence between heartbeats, in the space between waking and sleeping, perhaps you can hear them too. The night is dark, but you are safe. Let the mists embrace you. Let the waters carry you gently away.